Welcome to Not Quite Right. My name's Ed.
And I'm Amanda.
This is the Longlist episode for the July 2024 Not Quite Right prize.
Woo!
So as usual, we'll be going through all of the stats, all the submission stats, all of the prompt stats, including our favourite responses to the prompts.
We're also going to be touching on a bit of an interesting topic. We've got some questions from some of our listeners on social media, and one of those questions was a very interesting question, and I've got quite a long-winded but hopefully detailed and useful answer to it. So stick around for that one. This is for anybody who enters any flash or microfiction competition.
So we'll be going through all of our entrant questions from social media. And at the very end of the podcast, we'll be reading the long list in full. So stay tuned for your name. Well,
I mean, we say at the end, but we know some people have already skipped straight to
That's
it
right.
and they're coming back. So welcome back if you've done that.
But do come back and listen to it all because there's a lot of good information in this episode.
Absolutely. As per usual as well, we're going to be calling out some of our favourite lines, some of our favourite titles, some of our favourite takes on the prompts. Now, this does not mean that you necessarily made or did not make the long list. That list comes at the end of the episode.
What's not going to be in this episode, though, are the Daredevils.
No.
So we've decided to split the Daredevils out and give them each their own episode going forward, unless they happen to be on the shortlist, in which case they will be in the shortlist episode. And the reasons for that is so that we can get these episodes out sooner. So the long list episode out sooner and the shortlist episode out sooner, because there's just a lot of editing to do for all these Daredevils. But if you've purchased the Daredevil package, you will get your own special episode in which we'll read out your story and talk about it. All right, so let's get started with the stats. And starting with the country stats. So last comp, we actually had an equal amount of US and Australian entrants, making up basically 2/3 of the entrants. So this time around, we had a little bit more from Australia. So 35% Australian, a little bit more than a third.
Aussie, Aussie, Aussie.
USA still second, 31%, followed by the UK at 15%. Canada 3%, Germany 2%, New Zealand 2%, and then just a few entrants from the remaining countries on the list, which are Malaysia, France, Ireland, Netherlands, Sweden, Cambodia, China, Greece, Hungary, India, Isle of Man, Italy, Japan, Lithuania, Peru, Spain, and Switzerland.
Is Isle of Man not in Great Britain?
It's a territory or a protectorate or something like that of the UK, but it's not actually in Great Britain.
Oh.
Right?
I don't know. But hello to everyone from all of those countries. It's so thrilling to know. And I know some of those people are expats too, who are living in those countries. So welcome. Please spread the word. We love the fact that people all over the world are getting involved in this competition. Okay,
on to the gender stats. So, as always, the women outnumber the men. Actually, last time we had basically a 2-to-1, 67% female, 27% male. Well, that was the last comp. This one, the ladies have increased.
Wow.
So 71% female this time around to 25% male, 3% non-binary, 1% prefer not to say. All right, age demographic, fairly similar to last time as well, under 18 with 2%, 18 to 30, 24%, 31 to 45, 39%, 46 to 60, 26%, and over 60, 9%. Notable this time, our audience skewed a little bit younger. So we had a little fewer over 60s and a little bit more kind of around the middle there in the 18 to 30 and 31 to 45 range.
Right. So our gang, most popular once again.
Yep, and I am in that age group. I think we extended that because I'm in it for a bit longer now. I'm in that for an extra couple of years. So the total number of words we read in this round of the competition was 100,276, almost bang on 100,000, which is pretty much the same number of words as To Kill a Mockingbird and Hunger Games.
Yeah, and once again, we read many of those words, way more than once.
We sure did.
One thing I wanted to touch on is that there were a couple of potential disqualifications this time around. So 2 people put their name in the brief description field, which is a strictly non-identifiable field. And so that's a no-no. Now, on this particular occasion, we discussed it and we decided, look, it's not going to impact our judgment.
Yeah, I think you saw them and I didn't see them.
I saw them first and I deleted it. and honestly then subsequently forgot which was which because I deleted all the details. And so I wasn't worried about it, besides which it's not people that I have a personal relationship with or anything like that, so I didn't feel like it would affect my judgment. But yes, it is a risk, so please do not put your name or anything identifying about you in that brief explanation field, because we really don't want to disqualify anyone. We're going to work really hard not to, because we know how hard you work on your stories.
And the reason being, we want to judge this completely blind. We don't want our knowledge of certain writers to overpower the merits of the story. So we want to make sure it's all even level for everyone, and that's why we want to make sure that we don't know who is writing each story.
Exactly. And so with that brief explanation field, like that's a bit of a luxury. Like we put that there because the anti-prompt is a bit challenging, because we want people to have an opportunity, if they need to sort of explain what they've done so that they're not risking disqualification on missing a prompt kind of thing. But to have that, to continue with that, we need to make sure that nobody's entering any personal information. So please do not put your name there.
Yeah. There was a third one that came pretty close to disqualification as well. And that was one that we read, and it did make the long list.
So with this story, we both read it, and it made the long list on its merits. But when we went back to it, we couldn't quite tell how it had met the anti-prompt. And I mean, once you did come to me with your suggestion of what they were doing with the anti-prompt, I fully agreed with you. And so it's not an issue, and that person did still make the long list. But I guess, again, we want to keep it fair and make sure that people are really embracing that challenge.
All right. So our shortest entry last time around was 198 words. This time was a little bit longer at 283 words, which was a story called The Countryside is Full of Terrors by Roxanne Kubiak.
Now, last time you said that you might have to limit the title field, and I think that may be on the cards.
Yeah, that may be on the cards. I didn't do it last time around. So our previous record was 23 words from the April comp, which was itself a record, like a doubling on the previous longest title. But now we've actually had two stories that exceed it. The first one, which is actually the runner-up this time around at 30 words.
If you can believe it.
And the story is called Valerie, or the vixen who has stood as both my closest confidant and ongoing adversary since our tender days of youth, our perpetual rivalry, the harbinger of my eventual downfall, by Sheridan Bell.
Yikes. So that's just a gentle 30 words there.
But the winner and the ultimate cause of the fact that we will have to restrict the length of this title field, at an amazing 42 words, is the story entitled The 1941 Uprising in Oswiecim, the real story of one of Poland's villages overtaken by the Nazis, and the plight of the villagers to protect what was theirs during 1941 at the beginning stages of the creation of Auschwitz-Birkenau and the village of Brzezinska, by Lily Finch. And now it's time for Amanda's swearing stats.
All right, so this is not for sensitive ears, so skip ahead if you have sensitive ears. Yep. And look, I don't know why I'm still doing this, to be honest, but it's fun. Now, both of us commented on the fact that the swearing was way down
Way
this
down.
round.
I barely noticed it.
No.
There was just one or two instances.
It was, dare I say it, an appropriate amount of swearing.
Yeah, I think it was.
So everyone got it out of their system last round, I think, and now everyone's just focusing on telling a good story, which 2 thumbs up for that.
Exactly.
So do you want to hazard a guess? Most popular swear word.
I can't remember what they were last time, what the most popular was. It was fuck before, and it's got to be again, right?
No.
No.
Okay, so in January it was fuck.
Yeah.
But last time and this time it is shit. Okay, and so we had 35 shits, including 4 bullshits and 1 batshit.
And that's, what did you say, 35?
35.
35
last round
out
it
of
was
over
82.
200. Yeah, that's way down.
And
way
as
down.
per usual, some stories just go hard and make up for the others. So fuck came second, and it was a close second at 32, including 1 motherfucker and 1 fuckwit. So that's way down. So last time was 80, and the time before was 64. So really way down. Next was bitch at 13, including 1 bitch slap. Then we had ass, assholes, etc. Well, when I say ass, what I mean is ass,
Yep.
asshole, or asshole.
Yep.
And we had 12 of those. We had 4 bastards, 2 twats. So that was up. Twat was up. Dicks. Now, last time we had 13 dicks. This time we only had 1.
1 dick.
1 dick.
But I will say there were several stories featuring dicks,
Yes.
but were a little bit less explicit in the way that they featured them.
Yeah, and then there was some that were like super explicit.
But avoided the word at
Avoided
least.
the word. So the word was only broached once. And once again, no vaginas.
There were some reproductive holes though.
There were indeed. There was 1 prick, which was down from last time. 0 uses of piss, which we've never had 0 before. And 0 cocks, although technically 1 cocksucker. All right, but we'll get to that.
The cock is implied.
And then finally, which is good news for all the vagina lovers, there was 1 C-bomb, which came, I thought, in quite a fun and whimsical way in the word cuntstable.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And also using our table prompt in that word.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's fun. And then a bit euphemistically, we also had charisma, uniqueness, nerve and talent as the title of one of our stories, which is a initialism.
Speaking of which, I just watched a TikTok today about cunt as a name, as a family surname in England.
Oh,
because apparently it was a very popular one. And then all of a sudden, around the mid-19th century, people started changing their names for some reason. But it actually survives almost to the 20th century.
I wonder if one of them, one of their ancestors, is the reason.
Well, maybe. The original cunt.
The original
Patient
cunt.
0. A lot of them were actually in Australia. A lot of them came to Australia and then became...
Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Well,
A little bit of a history lesson for you.
Yeah. So that's my swearing stats. So way down. Well done, everyone. You've restrained yourselves this time. You have been very good. Now, when I say that, like you have, but at the same time, a couple of you, very, very naughty. Very naughty.
All right, so let's get to the Q&A, and we'll start with the general feedback that we received from the comp. So this is what people wrote in the general feedback field in the entry form. And I just want to say I really enjoyed reading these responses. There was so much positivity, so much positive feedback, people saying how much they love the comp and appreciate it, and that really kind of makes it worth it.
Yeah, because it's a lot of work. It's really a lot. And to know that you guys are getting so much out of it as well, it just warms the cockles of our heart. There you go. There's a cock for you.
So in terms of other feedback, there were some gripes about the submission form, mostly about formatting and sizing. And that's something that we're always looking at improving. We've said this before, that there are limitations in using a plain text versus a rich text field, and basically it's a compromise. But I do want to move that to a rich text field in the future.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people really do like formatting.
Yeah, and I do too. So I'm all for that. I don't think we'd ever use a platform like Submittable or anything like that, but certainly rich text form is hopefully on the cards.
Yeah.
But some people commented on the size of the field.
Yeah.
And can't you stretch it?
I think you can stretch the size of the field if you want.
So there's a little symbol, and this would apply for lots of text box fields like that on the internet. There should be like a little corner cut off, bottom right corner. And if you click and drag that, you can actually resize that field. And it's going to appear differently depending on what device you're on. And obviously, if you're doing this from your phone, then that's going to be a challenge always. But hopefully on a desktop, you should be able to stretch it out and make it easier for you to read. So that's an option.
Another piece of feedback that we had from a few people was about the anti-prompt, and from some people calling out how much they enjoy the anti-prompt, and from others about how challenging it was and also enjoyable. So I would just say to the people who were a little bit unsure about what the anti-prompt means and wanted some more information, that there are some articles to have a look at on the website. Well, the first one is WTF is an anti-prompt, which explains what an anti-prompt is and how the whole thing works. And then for each round of the competition, we publish an article about specifically that anti-prompt. So this time around, purple prose, what is purple prose and what are the different types of purple prose? And I think those are required reading before you start writing, so you have a good grounding for what we're expecting.
Yeah, so William Reardon said that he was wondering whether the anti-prompt was a guillotine or just loose cuffs. Like, will using it get you axed, or will something that's kind of borderline a bit be okay? And the answer is borderline's going to be okay.
Yeah.
We are on the side of inclusivity, as we were talking about before, with, really not wanting to disqualify anyone. That's not our vibe here. What we want to see is that you've engaged with the challenge.
Yeah.
But I will say that the people who really go all in and really embrace the challenge are often the ones who stand out. Of course, there is a level of skill required to show that you're not just going to fall down that hole that we're trying to avoid. But nevertheless, we can really appreciate when someone has challenged themselves.
Yeah, so don't forget to read those articles, check out those articles, and also just check out the article section on the website if you haven't already, because we publish not only the anti-prompt articles related to the prize, but also other just general writing articles. And they're all available to you if you're a competition entrant. And another thing worth doing is reading the past submissions, taking a look at winners from previous rounds and seeing how they've approached the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely, because obviously the winners are doing something right. Like, take inspiration from those people who have done well. But of course, like, try not to give us the same thing again because we've seen it. But one thing I really love to see in the comments as well is the people who are either new to Flash completely or new to writing, and it could be a young person, could be an older person who's just trying to engage with creativity. And I just really want to welcome you, because I hope you find this to be a safe space to experiment with that stuff, because it is fun. And I want that to be fun for you. I really feel like most people need creativity in their lives. So to think that we're providing a place for people to be creative and to explore their creativity is really rewarding for me personally. So please keep doing it. And the only difference between you and someone who's got all these credits under their belt is that you're at the start of that journey, and you will get there one day if you want to. And also those people who maybe writing was a thing in the past and for whatever reason, life circumstances, they've been busy, it's something they've lost touch with and they're reconnecting with it. And again, welcome. Flash fiction, I think, is a really great avenue back to creativity for people who are time poor or perhaps have maybe caring responsibilities for children, parents, others. You can just sneak away for a little bit and write a short story, very, very short story. And I applaud you for doing so, because it's hard to be creative, especially when you have stress in your life or you're time poor, because it's draining.
And I find it a rewarding thing as well, because it's a fairly short time commitment, and at the end of it, you get a finished piece. So
it's very satisfying.
Exactly.
That's right.
All right. So a couple more bits of feedback here. So one thing that a few people commented out is the disappointment at the fact that some of the packages sell out pretty quickly, and I think the Daredevils have already sold out. Have they already sold out?
They sold out in what was it, 3 days?
Yeah, for the October round, for the next round.
Yeah.
Look, that's something we're always looking at, because we would love to do as many as humanly possible. But the Daredevils and the critiques are also the most labour-intensive pieces, and we put a lot of work into them, as you can imagine. We would love to do more, but unfortunately we just need to balance it. It needs to be something that we can both reasonably do, given our other lives. So that's the limitation there. So all I'll say is get in early. I think there are still some critique slots available for the October prize, although the Daredevils have sold out. Another thing that a couple of people commented on in the general feedback form was the timing of the comp, especially for people who are not in Australia.
Yeah, but we do allow 60 hours, which is longer than some other comps. So you do get that little bit of extra time, technically, and you should be able to sleep on it at some point.
Yeah. I don't think there's too much that we could do about it. We couldn't really do it on a rotating, based on your time zone kind of thing, because other people would get the prompts earlier than others, and it's a bit unfair. So
I think 60 hours is generous.
60 hours is fairly generous, and the limitation is part of it.
So I just wanted to call out a comment from Lauren Doherty, who said, I also think the podcast is edited very well, as the pacing is spot on. I can listen to the hours-long episodes without ever feeling like you've gotten off topic or fallen into personal banter, which I feel occasionally happens with other pods. And I just want to say a big thank you to our editor-in-chief for keeping me concise.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate that. I did read that comment, and it made me very happy to read. And there is a lot of effort that goes into the editing for these podcast episodes, because we do want to keep it interesting. I too have listened to podcasts where they just ramble on for ages. And
look, rest assured that we ramble on.
We ramble on. We record often up to 4 hours worth of content, and we bring it right down to under 2 hours. So there's a lot that's kind of cut. And for any listeners who haven't heard the regular podcast episode, we would love it if you'd give it a go.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just a couple more things. One was from Bron Morrison, who said, I was brave enough to post in the forum this time around, which was both fun and helpful. So good on you, Bron, because there really is for some people that real leap of faith in sharing your work publicly. It's one thing to sort of send it off to judges, in a big pile of stories, and it's another to really put your name to it and put it out there in the forum. And I hope that's something you continue to do, because that is 100% the fastest way to get better, is to just share and learn from your fellow competitors. And I also just wanted to call out Loquacious Lamb, who said, the whole concept of the anti-prompt is so far up my alley. It's like crawling up the skee ball ramp to drop one straight in the 1,000-point bucket. So welcome, Loquacious Lamb. I'm so glad you're here. Yeah, it's up my alley too. And finally, a little comment from last round's winner, Chad Frame, who said, I've had a great experience several times over. This time around, I'm here to have fun.
Excellent.
Us too. So let's have some more fun. Now we get to the curly questions. So a question from Tom with an H on Twitter, who's a regular. And Tom says, as you read more and more stories, are you starting to find you have some favourite, inverted commas, writers? Do you try to guess which stories are theirs? And if so, do you ever guess right?
So I know you have a lot to say about this, because you're always attempting to guess the writers.
Guessing, yes. And look, I'm the one who's always on Twitter. If you hadn't noticed, guys, that is me, obviously. And so, I've gotten to know people on Twitter, and I've also, for some of these writers, I've read other work of theirs, or in some cases, we're beta reading for each other. And so we've sort of developed these sort of writerly friendships online. So I do try to guess. Now, last time, with one exception, I guessed completely wrong. So it's not like I'm out here cheating. I actually have no idea, but I do like to try. And I tried this time, and anybody who does follow us on Twitter will know that I failed immediately, because one of my guesses told us that she DNF'd and didn't even enter. So that guess was out the window immediately. And apart from that, I made 4 other guesses. Now, of those guesses, 3 were right this time.
Oh, yeah. It was a pretty good rate. I saw your comments there. For me, it's not something I look out for, right? No. But there have been occasions where I've read a story and I've thought, I wonder if this is written by, someone from the last comp. It had some sort of similarity. And so far, I've never been right.
No. And
close.
This is the thing. Sometimes the similarity is actually off-putting, because it's actually someone completely different.
Yeah.
And that person wouldn't do a similar story again the second time around. So look, we absolutely have no idea. I do like to try and guess. This time I was a little bit closer to the mark. Now, the other kind of hidden part of that question was, do we have any favourite writers? And the answer to that is yes. Every single person who manages to submit an entry is my favourite. And I know that sounds like a real cop-out, but truly, I love every single person who enters this comp. From the person who's it's their first time and they have no idea what they're doing and they're just flailing about, panicking because this is all very hard and the anti-prompt is next level challenging. You are my favourite, all the way up to those names that we've seen a few times on the long list or even on the short list. Also my favourite. I love you all.
Yeah, I completely agree. I really loved reading all the stories, as always.
All right. So Freya on Twitter asked, what are your personal preferences for genres/writing styles? So that's the first part of the question. And we've talked about this before, but it probably bears repeating. Since you're all desperately wanting to win, then you're going to want to know what we like. So what do you like?
So, yeah, we have talked about this a little bit before, and I read a lot of kind of literary fiction and classic fiction and some sci-fi as well. And those genres sometimes have elements that don't necessarily work too well in flash fiction. So it's not necessarily what I enjoy reading kind of on a wider level that applies directly to flash fiction. It's kind of a you'll know it when you see it type of thing. The stories that really just stand out as original, bringing something new to the table, having great characters, those are the things that I really love.
Yeah, same. I mean, when you're reading hundreds, thousands of stories, sometimes you start to get a bit of a feeling of same, like I've seen this before. And so it is absolutely thrilling when we read something that's either really creative and different or really edgy or out there, or something that just really makes you feel something on a real emotional level. All of those things are going to get our attention. But for full transparency, I'm going to say I tend to lean towards contemporary drama kind of stories. I like ones that are relatable. I also love comedy. So things that push the envelope as well. Puns, just dumb, silly stuff I love. But look, it's hard to do well with a stupid story, right? If you're going to be silly, I love silly. Silly's fun. But it's challenging to make silly meaningful and emotional. So that's kind of, I guess, the challenge there as well. And both of us probably agree that we really love ideas. You know, when someone's putting like just a cool idea, or they've got like something original or some really gripping lines, those things are always going to work well. So basically just moved by any sort of compelling storytelling of any kind, like across any genre. If you're able to convey something really compelling, then that's going to make us sit up and pay attention. But having said all that, like, don't write for us. You should be writing for you. Like, what lights you up? What do you want to communicate? I think those questions are far more important than, hey, let's try to tick some boxes that the judges want. Because in fact, like, we're going to see through that, I think. And it's not going to be compelling and it's not going to have the impact you want. So it's kind of this weird catch-22. So ultimately, if you can just impress your own audience of one, I think you're probably going to do better than had you tried to, I guess, impress us or write for us specifically.
And I think realistically, we don't know what we want, and we don't know it until we see it.
Absolutely.
So if you're in with
we say we hate poetry, and then a poem comes second to like ignore us, basically.
No, if you do what you love and you do it well, then we'll love it too.
Absolutely. But having said that, and we'll get to this in a future question, but there are probably some things that I would steer away from, maybe. But we'll get to that in a minute. So the other part of that question from Freya wanted to know, when you both love a different story, how do you settle it? And this is a good question because this was an issue in this round of the competition. There was a story that Ed loved, like loved a lot. Like he wouldn't shut up about it. And I didn't love it so much. I did like it. I thought it was great, but I didn't love it. So how did we settle that?
I think we try to be objective, generally speaking, and look at each story, and when we disagree, highlight what works, what doesn't work, and try to be a little bit objective, because it's easy to just kind of get caught up in the emotion that you feel when you read a story that you love. But I think it's also important to give weight to that emotion. Like, oh my God, I loved a story on first reading, and then you kind of pick it apart and realize, oh, maybe it has some problems here and there. You still need to give that emotional reaction a lot of weight. So we try to convince each other. We try to be a little bit impartial and a little bit objective about it. But ultimately, someone has to compromise.
Yeah, ultimately. And I think too, this is really mainly an issue at shortlist level.
Yeah.
Right. Because if one of us loves a story, it's going on the long list, even if the other didn't. So there is one on the long list that I really liked. I picked it as kind of a favourite, and Ed didn't rate it for the long list. That sort of got an automatic boost. If you're a favourite, you're on the long list. But beyond that, like once we're talking shortlist, we consider it a privilege and an important job, I guess, to decide the winner fairly. In our view, obviously it can't be strictly objective, but to the best of our ability, decide a winner on its merits. And so that's when these conversations come up and we have to sort of, I guess, discuss our pros and cons and then come to a conclusion. But I will say the winner of this round, we both agreed deserved the winning place.
And I think that was the case last round as well.
Yeah, I think it was an easy choice for winner last time. Now on Instagram, the Canberra Tales asked, is a great storyline or technical perfection more important?
So I'd say both are important. And I would just want to clarify as well. So if by storyline you mean plot, then I think that's not so important in flash fiction. So we're not looking for like a great plot necessarily. There are other elements that can shine through more strongly, like character or voice, or just the emotional impact of the writing, its originality. Sometimes its absurdity can really work in your favor. In flash fiction, you don't really have the time to engross your reader in a plot-based story as you might if you want to sit down with a crime thriller, for example. You just don't have the space to replicate that same thing in flash fiction. But all of those other elements that I just mentioned about character voice are very important. And I would also say that technical perfection is not something that necessarily exists.
Yeah,
right? So
I was just going to say, no such thing.
Yeah. We often read stories that have excellent sentence structures, for example, that are not compelling stories. So you can't really have one without the other. In terms of technical perfection, what's important is understanding the basic elements of story.
So, I mean, apart from storytelling skills, which is what you're talking about, developing character and these sorts of things, is a storytelling skill as well as being a writing skill. If we're talking more technical skills like spelling, sentence structure, and so on. I think probably one of the ones that is super important is clarity.
Yeah.
So being able to convey what you're trying to convey in a way that we can understand. And I do think some stories sometimes suffer from a lack of clarity. But if you've got a couple of typos in there, or if you've got too many adverbs or something, well, I mean, maybe that's going to impact how we read your story and how it makes us feel. But it's not like we're there nitpicking, looking for this stuff. It's really a bigger picture of, did this story move me, or did this story make me think or make me feel something, as opposed to like, oh, I'm going to go through with a red pen.
I will say, though, that as you start really getting to the top, if you want to win or if you want to shortlist, then that technical ability does...
It's more important
It becomes more important.
Because we do feel sometimes like I do tend to get swept up in the ideas and love an idea. And then when I go and sit down and look at it again to compare against another story, I go, oh, hang on, no, this one didn't quite deliver what the other did. And so it is important. But look, these are skills you should be all constantly working to improve, no matter what your level of ability. Like, we can always learn more and do more. So just keep going, keep learning. Alicia Rourke on Instagram wanted to know if we had any editing tips. Are there any words or phrases that we should be editing out?
A specific piece of feedback is just to look out for cliche phrases. That's one of the things that I really notice. If you use a phrase like all hell broke loose, for example, or, you know, bite the bullet, turn a blind eye, just things like that you hear over and over again. Look out for those cliche phrases, and if you can rework that into a more original way to say it. Or even just
straightforward sometimes.
Yeah, a more literal way, or something that even if you can go the next step and do something that works specifically for that story, that feeds into that story, and again, highlight something about the characters or the story that you want to impart, that would be ideal. But apart from that, I'll say probably stress less about the words that you use. I think a lot of writers think too much about constructing good sentences, and I don't mean grammatically correct sentences, but like beautiful sentences, when they should be spending that time in the content of the story.
Well, I would say too, like, again, we do have some tips on the website, and this is all coming from us. So if you want our specific thoughts, then those articles are going to give you some ideas. For example, we talked about naming your characters, because that was a little pet peeve that was cropping up from time to time. So if you look there, you'll get some more specific tips. But just to highlight one now would be, and I think I mentioned it in the last Longlist announcement for April, was sometimes thinking about that ending, maybe cutting your story off a bit sooner. So I think sometimes we sort of write to the end and we sort of wrap it up with a nice little bow. And I think in flash fiction, sometimes the nice little bow works amazingly, and other times leaving it hanging just that little bit is potentially a little bit more satisfying. So that's something to look at. If you're just talking about editing, go back to your story and think, maybe what if I edited it a paragraph sooner or a sentence sooner? What's the impact of that?
And it sometimes works the other way as well. Sometimes stories start a little bit too early and you want to get straight into the action.
Yeah, see if you can find a way to cut off the first 2 paragraphs and still nevertheless put some clarity in there and help us understand, but not necessarily all the backstory. So the other thing I would suggest, and so again, I mean, you could talk about editing forever. There's so much information on that online, so do continue to learn. But I guess the one last thing I would say is do go on the forum. Do share. If you physically can share your story with others, do that, because the one thing that will catch is what I mentioned before, which is the clarity. You will get everybody's dumb questions about, oh, I wasn't sure what you were getting at with XYZ. And that gives you a chance to clarify. And it's way better to do it then than to have us. And I'll be honest, like, we're tired. You know, sometimes when we're reading these, we've read a whole bunch of stories in a row. And so clarity can really kill a story, because we have to sort of figure out what it's trying to get at. And so if you can solve those problems before it gets through the gate, then that's going to be really helpful. So Kay Kellers on Instagram wanted to know about our process for whittling down the entire top X number to judge. Like, do you assign scores to all on the first go, then revisit all top scorers to order and choose winners? Or is it more qualitative, like flagging favourites? How do we do it? What's the process?
Yeah, so the process really is that we each read the stories and score them according to our own systems.
Yeah, basically. We've got our own systems.
Yep. And we highlight which ones we think should definitely go in the long list, which ones are our favourites, and then varying degrees of maybe considerations for the long list. And then once we've both independently judged them, we compare the two lists and we work out which ones definitely go in, the ones that we each think of as favourites, the ones that are borderline, and we also highlight stories to each other to reread that we may have initially missed some aspect of. Like there are stories that I've loved that you haven't loved, and I've said, read this again, maybe you didn't kind of get this, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And so we get that down. I think this time around, by following that process, we got it down to about 42, I think it was, or 43.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, once we've done our scoring and so on, I put those together and took both of our top rated ones and compared them. So all of your top rated up to a certain point, which was around 60 of your top stories, and then similar to mine, and compared them. And I think I came back with 80-something stories from that. From there, I was able to whittle down further ones where both of us had scored sort of fairly low maybes kind of thing. And so they dropped off the list. And then, we ended up, it just happened kind of neatly. I think it was more like 45-ish that we had that we'd both rated well, or it may have been a favourite of mine and not of yours, or and so on. And then from there, we had to basically cull 5.
Yeah. We had to reread some of the stories that we kind of rated the lowest and then decide which ones we were most comfortable with removing from the long list.
So anybody who follows us on Twitter might have seen that I had said, basically, I think it was 32 that were definite in, and then it was 13 that were vying for the final 8 spots. And so basically it was ones that Ed had preferred that I reread, and then ones that I had preferred that he reread, and we both sort of thought about, okay, of these, which would we let go? So, I mean, that sucks for those people who are so close and who drop off. But, you know, that's the way it is. It's tough. It's tough for us. I don't like to make that call sometimes. I know there's a real human being on the other end of that.
Yeah, for sure.
But also at the same time, like, there's no satisfaction if everyone gets a prize at the end. We're all working towards something that's challenging and hard to get.
Yeah, and we have said before, we try to keep it fair in other ways. We randomise the order of the entries, so the order they arrive in is not the order we read them. We kind of shuffle them all around, and then we read random batches. And so we try to keep it very fair in any way that we can.
But ultimately, it is going to be completely subjective.
Yeah.
And so I fully expect many of you to disagree with our judgments and to say, look, my story was better. And on certain criteria, I'm sure it was. And that's tough because, maybe you were technically more proficient by a lot than another story that made it. And for whatever reason, that story just shone to us.
Yep.
But in terms of how we go then from the long list to the short list, on this particular occasion, it was kind of serendipitous because, again, comparing the scores, when we compared our top rated of each, we didn't have that. We had like 6. Yeah. And it was like, that's the number of prizes we have. And when I went back, because I don't just go, oh, that's good enough.
Yep.
I went back and read them. I'm like, no, they're my top 6 actually. So I was really happy with the ones that made it through. However, there was one story which upon rereading and reflection, I thought to myself, I actually have another one in mind which didn't rank as high, but which is still in my mind, which I am still thinking about, which I think deserves to be here. And so we talked about it, and it was tough. I think
those 2 stories were very close. They both had pros, they both had cons.
Yeah, but very close in terms of how we felt about rating them. Not very close at all in terms of what they were. And so they were completely different.
Oh, yeah.
And you couldn't ever objectively compare the 2 stories. I would say one, you might argue, was more technically proficient. This is what we're talking about before. And in fact, that was the one that dropped off because the other one was still in my mind because it was so memorable. And so how do you judge that? It's very difficult. But we did resolve that problem.
We did.
We resolved that problem for our own consciences by awarding poor number 7 a wildcard prize.
That's right. Yeah.
So we'll get to that. But it's tough. Look, honestly, I would expect some of you to rant and rave and hate us forever because of our poor judgment. But it's the way it is. Just as an extension of that, Shannon Ballantyne on Instagram said, when putting together the long list and short list, what are the key things you consider in terms of tiebreakers for stories close in quality? Like, do you veer more towards entertainment value or craftsmanship? Well, as I just said, in this particular occasion, I guess we veered towards entertainment rather than craftsmanship. But I wouldn't say that that's the rule.
No.
I would say it's always a challenge. So many factors are being compared, so many pros and cons for both stories if we're comparing two stories to make a decision, if we're talking tiebreakers here.
Yeah, I think either way, the story has to leave us with something. We have to read it and think either, what a great concept that had me thoroughly entertained, or what a great piece of writing, I love the prose. And probably into the long list, either one of those is often enough to kind of get it over the line. But when you're talking a little bit higher up, you do need a little bit of both.
Yeah, ultimately, when it comes to tiebreakers, and there are tiebreakers at the long list too, because there are people who end up dropping off or another story is chosen in favour of their story on the long list. And again, it's not one thing or another thing. It is many things that go into that melting pot that we have to consider. And ultimately, we make our call and someone else might make a different call. We on a different day might have made a different call, but we do our best to, I guess, the one that ticks the most boxes or ticks them the most effectively is going to be the one that wins out. Cheryl King on Instagram just wanted to know if we liked hers. So I guess we'll see, Cheryl. So finally, last question. Melody Mulrooney on Twitter asked, what's the one thing you see showing up regularly that you wish writers would stop doing?
So I've got a few little pet peeves. So one is withholding information from the reader.
No, I agree.
One thing that a lot of writers try to do is develop a story into kind of a big reveal at the end. And the problem with that is it doesn't really keep the reader engaged in a meaningful way. You want to know about the characters. You want to know why they're doing the things that they're doing, what motivates them. You're trying to use your story to build a connection to the character for the reader. And often withholding things like who they really are and what actually motivates them and where they really are works against you, right? And I think that's the difference sometimes between flash fiction and a longer story where you can withhold some key elements and still give the reader enough to kind of drag them along. I feel with flash fiction, you just don't have time. You've got to give the reader everything.
Yeah, I agree. So one of my comments that I had here was mystery that shouldn't be mystery. And what that looks like, I guess, is not dropping us into the scene straight away.
Yep.
And again, bearing in mind that this is a flash fiction competition rather than some other format. When we're reading these, we're reading them all in a row.
Yep.
And so you're coming from one story world and you're being transported into a completely different story world. And if I don't get an immediate sense of the context of this story, whatever that may be, then I have not yet arrived at your story when I'm reading it.
Yep.
And this is what you're saying. Like, you've got too many questions in your mind. You're sort of like, you're lost. You're lost in the story world. And I think that writers maybe do this because they're trying to have a little bit of an air of mystery or create a certain vibe. And that may be appropriate sometimes. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's impossible to pull this off. But more often than not, if you can, in that first sentence or two, I want to know who is the character. Yep. I want to know where they are and what they're doing. And if you can convey that really quickly, okay, great. And if you do that in a way that also implies the tone, like maybe this is a comedic piece or a nostalgic piece, if I can get all that in the first couple of sentences, then you've got me. Okay, now let's go. And I think sometimes writers feel like maybe that's boring or not engaging enough. It is, in fact, to me, very engaging if I can very quickly drop into the scene in a way that's interesting. And I mean, we've got some other pet peeves, like we talked about not naming your characters. So another one just linked to that is these hanging lines of dialogue as a first line. So we've got a line of dialogue and then I have no idea who said it or who they said it to or what it's about. And again, it's trying to create an air of mystery, but what it is actually creating is just confusion. So I'd avoid that if possible.
Kind of linked into the withholding information, one of my pet peeves is unearned twists, what I'll call unearned twists. So these are twists where you read through a story and all of a sudden in the last paragraph there's a twist. But the twist is not really supported or built up by the story. What it means for a reader is that you kind of get invested in characters in a situation and you follow it along and you think it's about one thing, and right at the end the rug gets pulled out from under you and it's actually about something else. And that often undermines what the story is about. It often undermines the emotional impact of the story because you've been along for the ride and now you've just been given this curveball at the last minute. So when you have a twist in your story, it really needs to be backed up by the story. The story needs to build up to it. The point of the twist is to cast the story into a new light, but the light has to have been there from the beginning. And I'll use the example of Bruce Willis in The Sixth Sense. And spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen that movie yet, but it's the one that we all talk about when we talk about twists. At the end, you find out that Bruce Willis has been dead the whole time and he's actually a ghost or whatever, right? And imagine if that movie had that twist at the end, but it wasn't actually supported by the movie. Like, he was just interacting with other people and it was just like a normal dude and then he's a ghost at the end. You'd walk away out of that movie thinking, what? Like, I thought this was a movie about a guy and he's a ghost for some reason at the end. And that's sometimes the reaction I have to some stories when the twist is not earned. You know, it needs to be supported by that story. I want to read the twist and go, oh, right, now I get it, not hang on,
and then
this
you
has
read
just
the
overturned
story
everything
again,
I've read.
and then you enjoy everything a second time.
That's right, because all the clues were there. It was all about those little clues.
And I will say that there's a story that springs to mind that did make the shortlist this round, which did achieve a twist that was earned.
Yeah.
And which you loved.
Yes, definitely.
A couple of other things I would say, and these are, okay, so again, back to the articles on the website, but the article that is How to Win the Not Quite Right Prize talks about 5 different things that are top tips basically for things that you should be focusing on in your story. And I would come back to those time and again because they're fairly straightforward things, but they're also things that people miss often. And 2 things I'll mention here just in answer to Melanie's question about things that we wish writers would stop doing. One is biting off more than you can chew. So we get a lot of stories where, and it's particularly in 2 worlds, it's either a romance or a quest, where we're looking at either someone's entire love story from start to finish until they die, or a quest from start to finish. Now, this is a 500-word piece of fiction, and again, not to say you can't do it. You can, and people do these things successfully. But I guess you have to think carefully about how you're doing that and why you're doing that, and not necessarily presenting us with an entire, for example, an entire quest, because if you're doing that, we're only ever getting surface level details.
Yeah.
And when we're only getting surface level details, well, I'm not invested because it looks just like every other quest or just like every other love story. And so I prefer, I guess, to see typically tight a scene. Like I would say flash fiction is typically a scene. Not always, but usually.
Yeah, and I think one good rule of thumb is if your story has a scene break or a time break or a time jump, especially if it has more than one, then think about how you can fit those into one scene, or think, do you really need the prologue to the main scene and then the aftermath to the main scene? Think about how you can really condense that, because it's all about getting that emotional energy out of your story. And you often don't need the scene where, you know, in the romance where your character is kind of at home anticipating the upcoming date. Just get straight into it.
Yeah. Another one there is too much interiority. So we see a lot of stories where it's the entire story is actually someone's thought process. Again, it can be done very well, but typically what I want to see is the action of the scene. So this could be either someone who's nostalgically reflecting on something that's happened in the past. Just take me to the past. Like, I don't necessarily need this wistful looking back. Make me wistful by showing me the scene. And also scenes or stories where someone is watching something else happen, or they're watching someone else do something, and it's just adding this layer of, I guess, a barrier between me and the person who's actually in the story. So if you've got a character who is doing a lot of thinking in your story, then again, just look at that and just see, is this really achieving what I want it to achieve, or is it actually separating the reader another layer from the action?
Yeah. I mean, it's the whole show, don't tell thing as well. It's making your story active, making sure things are happening, making sure that what the reader sees, visualizes in their mind, is actual things taking place visually. When you read a story about things happening in a character's mind, it's just not as immediate and not as compelling. One thing I'd add as well as another little pet peeve, and it's probably kind of, I guess, it's a much wider topic, but stories that go deep into the premise without developing a story. And I find that to be very disappointing, because I've read so many stories where the premise is really gripping, like it's a great idea for a story, but then there is just no story. It's all about the premise. And this is something that a lot of sci-fi flash fiction stories are guilty of.
Yeah, we don't then have like characters in conflict with each other or some sort of dramatic climactic thing. It's just we're left with that idea.
Well, you read it and you think, oh, that would make a great setting for a story.
Yeah,
where's the story?
It would make a great novel. Yeah, for sure. All right, so final question. And this question comes from Holly Reelski on Instagram, who asked, are there some genres or tropes you prefer over others, or vice versa, any you just irrationally hate? Now, I love this question because I was already compiling my answer before she asked. So, yes, there are some that we irrationally hate, irrationally or perhaps very rationally, because we see them all the time. So I have like 11 pages of notes, Holly, all right?
So you're looking at a couple of examples of genres and tropes. You've written a whole article, basically.
I've written an article, and I will be releasing this article around the same time as this episode. So if you're interested in more information, and there will be more information on these, please do go to the website. Now, I just want to preface all of this with all of these things that I'm about to say. So what I'm going to call flash fiction tropes, the stuff we see all the time. All of it can be done well. Absolutely. And some of these have won our competition and certainly other competitions. All right. So this is not me saying that this cannot be done or that you should not do it. What I am saying is we see this a lot. So armed with that knowledge, maybe just make some decisions around how you're going to tell your stories.
I think the trick is as well that some of these story tropes may feel original because you're not a judge of a flash fiction competition. So you might think, oh, they probably haven't seen this before.
It feels super clever because they are clever. And there's a reason we see them time and again. And the reason is that they're deeply resonant stories. Yeah. They're resonating with a lot of people. And so therefore that's why a lot of people are thinking this is a really great story for a flash fiction competition. And they are, right? But the problem is that we see them all the time. Yeah. Okay. So and that's not your fault.
So you've got to find a way to stand out if you use one of these tropes.
I guess that's the preamble is, look, this is not me telling you don't do it. And I don't want you to be scared off doing it if it's something that's important to you or if you've got something cool or fresh to say. I guess I just want to be fair. I want to give you the knowledge that we have as to those things that we do see often, so that you're not, unfortunately, just stumbling upon the same idea that many other people have stumbled upon. Now, I will also say that I have verified this list with competition judges across 3 other competitions. Okay, so this isn't just me and Ed. I've got input from Max at Writing Battle, Nick at Twist in the Tail, and Dean from Furious Fiction, who have all put in some input here to say the ones that they do and do not see as well in their competitions. So you're about to get the knowledge and wisdom of judges across 4 flash fiction competitions.
This is insider knowledge.
It's total insider knowledge. I'm excited for you, honestly, because this is knowledge I would have liked to have had, because guess what I've done? Multiples of these tropes.
I know. Same.
Just ask Dean, because he's read them, because we've entered Furious Fiction.
Dean, don't go back and read my old stories, please.
Oh, he did already. He told me.
Oh, no. They're so terrible.
Look, we've all been guilty of some real clangers, all right? And it's only through this knowledge that we now have, reading thousands of stories, that we can, in fact, look back and reflect on our own writing.
Yes. In shame.
In shame
deeply.
Sometimes. But look, like, you guys have the advantage. You're about to find out now for free. You don't even have to judge a competition to find out. All right. All that having been said, number 1 of the topics that we see most often in our comp, and which is very commonly addressed in other comps too, are stories about domestic violence. Unfortunately, this is a very important topic. Okay, it's something that we see all too often in the real world. So I'm not surprised that it's being reflected in the flash fiction stories that we're seeing. I can see why, right? Because we've got 2 people, usually, in pretty much the most extreme type of conflict you can have, which is perfect for a story. That's what you want. The stakes are high, the conflict is high, the drama is high. That's all perfect fodder for a flash fiction story. Unfortunately, we see it so often that the challenge becomes, what are we going to learn different here? Like, what's going to be new and fresh here?
And there are a few standard approaches.
Yeah, this is the thing. So it's not just the fact that we see stories about domestic violence, it's that we see the same types of stories. So one of the ones that we see often, very specifically, an irredeemably bad and violent man pushes an innocent wife or girlfriend to the brink and she finally leaves him. Yep. Okay, and that's her redemption arc. And almost always we get a little moment in the story where we're zooming in on a bruise that she's trying to hide with long sleeves or something like that. Now, there's a few people right now going, oops, I wrote that story, right? Yeah, I bet you did, because it's common. And I'm not saying you did a bad job either, right? Because they're usually quite gripping stories. It's just unfortunate that it's so commonly found. I know that Max from vertiTABLE said that what he typically sees is that the man dies. So he gets his comeuppance in the end.
There is a revenge subgenre here, yes.
Yeah, and another one that we see as well is a child whose father is being violent either with the mother or a sibling, and the child kills the father. And then often the mum sort of has a knowing wink at the end to say, oh, I'm going to take the blame for you. So again, this is quite a common flash fiction trope that we see. So I know that domestic violence would be, for some of you, your life story. Yeah. And I think if that's something that you want to write about, then by all means, please don't let me stop you. What I guess I would like to challenge you to do is to find a way to express yourself and convey that emotion without necessarily leaning on those plot devices.
Yeah, I think it's about finding something interesting about the characters or the scenario in which it happens. You know, you wrote one actually for New York City Midnight not too long ago.
Yeah, very recently. Yeah. And I did it sort of annoyed with myself because I'm like, I'm doing that
full
thing.
Well it's a trope.
Yeah, knowing full well it's a trope. But again, it's that conflict. So, like I said, this is just information. Okay,
yeah,
it's a
just
common,
be aware.
Just be aware. It's a common topic. Now, another emotionally charged topic that we see a lot of is infant loss. And I would include in this category as well from miscarriage up to the loss of a baby or stillborn babies.
Yeah.
Now, I know that this is a deeply sensitive topic for many people. And if you want to write about your own story because you are processing your grief, then do that. Just do that. You don't stop, right? You absolutely should be. I do think, however, that this topic is often chosen by people who have actually had no experience with this issue because it is extreme and dramatic. And I'll be honest, I very insensitively call this trope dead babies, right? And the reason I say that is not because I'm insensitive to the issue. I'm deeply sensitive to the very real and very traumatic experience that people would have. But it is my, I guess, instinctive reaction to some people who are using this to sort of emotionally manipulate the reader. Yeah. That's what it feels like, right? And I say this knowing that now, having spoken to some of these other judges, they feel the same way. And we can tell, I would say usually, the difference between someone who is sharing their own experience versus someone who is trying to emotionally manipulate through one of the most tragic and extreme examples. So if this is your story, you should tell your story. If this is not your story, I say maybe stay in your lane, okay? Unless you have something fresh to say, unless you have something that you want to communicate about this issue, do not use this issue just to trigger people.
Yeah, I think this trope and the one before it, as you've said, that what they share in common is this kind of pre-built emotional energy that they contain. And it's tempting to want to latch onto that. And you know, as a writer, you're trying to develop an emotional energy in your piece, and here's one that it's out of the box, basically.
But it feels out of the box, doesn't it?
But that's right. So we see through that. We can see that that's not earned. So I would try to build that emotional impact through the characters and through the interactions and the situation they're in.
And Nick from Twist in the Tail would add to that as well, like the dog, like when the dog dies, it's the same sort of thing, like really leaning into that pre-built emotional impact. And I think too, like there was a story in this round, and I'll mention it later, that got me all teary about something way less than this, right? So you can actually convey that emotion, that deep emotion, on something else that's really simple. And usually the way to do that is to hone in on that specific sort of trigger that people have. By the way, like we're always telling people to ramp up the drama, right? And it doesn't get much more dramatic than infant loss. So I'm not saying it's wrong to go there. I guess our point that we've made is just don't just use and abuse that as a cheap tactic to try and get tears out of people.
And again, it does come down to the limitations of flash fiction, because imagine if you're watching a TV show and the scene of infant loss happens at the start of the show before you know any of the characters. Happens right at the start. You're not invested in any characters, but you see that scene. It actually doesn't have the emotional impact because you don't have that connection with the characters. as opposed to it happens during the season of the TV show when you know the characters and you've been through their journey and there's an infant loss happens. That's when you feel the emotional energy. So it's not just the prepackaged aspect, it's the undeserved aspect and the fact that you don't have that connection. If you can develop that character within that scenario and then add that layer in a way that's meaningful, then it works.
And I think that's why sometimes the true stories and the expressions of grief do shine through, because often those people, like, you can tell when someone's injected themselves into it. And often what they're doing is actually focusing on very specific details, which are quite telling in themselves about their personal life experience, as opposed to just sort of like the broader brushstrokes of the incident itself. All right, so those are some heavy topics. We also get some lighter topics that we see often. And one of those ones, which was a yes across the board from all 4 competitions, was what I like to call the trope of writer blocked. Okay?
I've been guilty of this one.
Yeah, I think Dean pointed that out, actually. So what do we write when we don't know what to write? Oh, I know. Let's write about not knowing what to write. Yes, you are in fact not the first writer to write about not knowing what to write. And often these stories, and they are often quite fun, the writer becomes increasingly sort of unhinged, and often we go into this kind of absurd or surreal kind of territory. And what I would say to those writers is, are you actually blocked? Or do you just want to write a really surreal, unhinged story and you feel like you can't? You are somehow like self-censoring, because why not just write that one? Yeah. Why not write the crazy thing that's coming out of you right now? Let it out. So maybe if you are feeling blocked, it might be helpful as an exercise to sort of write that story out and sort of get to that weird place. And then from there, just get weirder.
Yeah.
Like if you're going to fail anyway, right? If you're like, I'm blocked, these prompts suck, I'm going to DNF this story. If you're at that level, then write the weirdest shit, because if you're going to fail anyway, you might as well just go nuts. That's my opinion. All right, the next one is a trope I like to call cats being assholes. This is something that we have specifically seen a lot of, which is like the twist that in fact it wasn't a violent intruder who trashed the apartment, but in fact it was the pet cat.
Yeah, and then or a dog.
Or a dog.
In some situations.
And then we have that moment at the end where it's like, oh, fluffy, you know, and it's really super common. And speaking to the other judges, I guess they would broaden that. They'd say, look, it's more just that it's a surprise, it's a pet at the end of the story, or an animal. And this is probably one of those ones you were talking about where it's that unearned twist in a way. But I mean, it is earned in a sense, because you go back and you look and it's like, oh yeah, the cat could have trashed the bits and pieces, but
it's just that feeling of, I thought I was reading one thing and I was invested in one thing, but actually it's just something completely different. It's the rug being pulled out from under you rather than enhancing the story.
Yeah, for sure. And look, again, it's just something we've seen a lot of. I guess there's a lot of writers with cats.
Yep.
And I think sometimes when we're stuck for inspiration, we look to our nearest environment and guess what? The cat is on the keyboard. Yeah. So we're going to write about the cat. Now, an extension of that one is talking pets, right? We see talking pets a bit. We've got Animal Farm out there, right? There's nothing wrong with talking animals. We can sometimes explore some themes with talking animals and it can be quite fun. But what we tend to see is some same sort of stuff, right? So maybe there's a committee of animals planning a jailbreak kind of thing, and the sassy cat is the leader and the dog is saying dumb shit about just food. And then, you know, there's a bird and the bird is a parrot, so there's a joke about it repeating. So, like, it's sort of just that cliche world of like that Animal Farm world, right? The committee of pets.
And for me, that one comes back to the whole idea of just being a premise and not a story, because that is a premise. And from there, you can't just have your animals interacting in the way that they do because they're that animal and have a story.
Yeah, it's a cliche, right?
You need to have a story.
The cat is like the sassy one with the attitude and it's a bit sort of snarky. Like that's just a cat cliche. Like, we need a bit more than that. And Max from Writing Battle also added that this applies to children too. Like you've got kids planning a daycare jailbreak kind of thing. So similar sort of thing. So again, like if you're going to do that, well, what are you going to bring that's fresh in you? Because we've seen it. And that doesn't make what you've written a bad story. It's just unfortunately not in any way going to surprise or delight because it's like one of many. Another one. Okay. And this one, I think, is one of those ones that feels like deeply resonant. And that's why we see it a lot. And a lot of people have this idea, this same idea, which is kind of cool. I think that humans can be on this same wavelength, right? And I like to call this trope hubby's garden grave. And this is a story about a perpetually aggrieved wife who murders her mere male husband. Okay. So her husband is a bit of a pain in the bum. He's always been a bit of a pain in the bum. He does one last final pain in the bum thing and she cracks and she kills him, usually with a kitchen knife, not always. And then always buries him in the garden.
And the story is usually the very serene wife at the end of it, just kind of reflecting back. And
she's planted some lovely flowers on top. He's pushing up daisies, literally. Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is a fun plot, right? And that's why it comes up a lot, because it's kind of ironic, you know, and it sort of comes full circle, like all of these satisfying things about a story. So again, a lot of these stories are actually quite fun to read because they are quite character driven. And each of us are married, so you reflect on all your little nitpicks that you have in your relationships, and it can be fun, but it's just quite literally being done to death. So,
I will say, though, if the fact that you're writing that is preventing you from murdering your husband,
please keep writing.
Please keep writing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just a bit of a sad reflection on society, isn't it? That all these mere male husbands are getting killed off, whether they're getting murdered and buried in the garden or just otherwise like getting their comeuppance. It's always the husband. It's never the wife.
No. I think if there are any missing husband unsolved mysteries, the garden is the first place to look. Okay,
so this is what I would say, right? If we're going to pull off a murder of an annoying spouse, we're going to need a new MO.
Choose a different place.
All right. The next trope I like to call surprise dementia. And this comes in a number of different forms, although one form I have seen a number of times is a man who's reflecting on his past love, who is in fact on his way to see her. And he's taking a bunch of her favourite flowers. Okay. And you might start out thinking they're on their first date or early in their relationship. Pretty soon you learn, in fact, she's in care. She has dementia. He's going to visit her in a nursing home. He's taking her old favourite flowers, and then he arrives and he finds out she's been dead for some time. Surprise, you're the one with dementia. You might not be going home today. What I think is quite nice about these stories is that irony. That irony of we think she's the one with dementia, it turns out he's the one with dementia. That's a satisfying arc in a story, and it's enough for a piece of flash fiction. Once again, it's just unfortunately something that we see a lot of. And surprise dementia comes in a few different forms, and it is sometimes, again, one of those unearned twists that you get where you think you're getting one thing and then it turns out, in fact, this person has dementia. And we do sometimes see that in relationships with children as well, like children are visiting and the person doesn't recognize them, and we're getting that interplay as well. And usually this is done in that way to enhance the irony as opposed to an expression of character and feeling. So again, if you're going to go there, maybe have a little bit of a think about, like, beyond kind of the twist, this person has dementia, like make us care about the impact that that's having and the conflict that that's creating within these relationships, as opposed to just leaning on the fact of the dementia being the core component of the story. All right. Now, the next one is one that I like to call surprise lesbians. Now, in fact, it's not always lesbians, all right? There are a lot of different iterations of this particular relationship. Very specifically, it is this story. A young person feels a connection with another young person of their own sex or of like a genderqueer relationship and risks it all to make a move. Never fear, the feeling is mutual and always sealed with a kiss. I guess it's that sort of, that first flush, that coming out of the closet kind of moment, which is a deeply pivotal moment for many people. So absolutely perfect fodder for a flash fiction piece. But unfortunately, it's sort of presented as this twist, and it doesn't come off as a twist to us because we've seen it so many times. And often I can see it coming well before. Like in the first paragraph, sometimes I can sense this very specific plot development that's going to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes the same-sex relationship is the twist that they're both that they both turn out to be lesbians. But sometimes the story is, well, actually, one of the people is a different gender to who you thought, and it's like surprise, it's actually two women or two men.
Yes.
And that's even less compelling, I
Yeah,
think.
it's 2024.
Yeah, it's not really a...
Yeah, and look, like I said, that deeply pivotal moment, absolutely, that is something that I'd love to read stories about because it's such a potentially high conflict time, certainly high stakes time for people. And if you've got something to say about it, I want to read it. I guess what I don't want to read is like, oh, surprised they were gay.
Yeah.
Like, I don't
focus on the twist, focus on the emotions.
Yeah, exactly. I want to know about those characters. Like, what is it about them that makes this relationship deeply meaningful or challenging or whatever it might be, beyond the fact that they are of the same sex? And if that is something that you've experienced in your life and that you have been through some severe conflict with, maybe give us like a different moment, like not necessarily that coming out of the closet moment, but something else about that you found specifically challenging, and present that instead. All right. The next trope is in the dark. In a dystopian future, society has lived underground for generations. A rebel questions what they are hiding about the outside world. The answer? Nature.
Yeah.
Specifically a lot of underground civilizations.
This is a common sci-fi trope.
Yeah, it is. So we see this on TV, in movies a lot, okay? So it's something that we've seen. And I think my issue with this particular one, beyond the fact that I've seen it, unfortunately, and so therefore it's not new, is the fact that we sort of just get left hanging with nature's out there. Yeah. But we never get a sense of who this they is and why they're hiding nature and why people have been living underground for generations. And so therefore it all sort of means nothing. It's like,
you're just not going to tell that story in a satisfying way in 500 words. No. It's impossible.
Yeah, and it has been told before. I guess it's fun to explore sometimes those stories that you know and love. But again, it's going to be a hard sell in a competition setting. Now, I thought this next one was just us, but Dean presented this himself, and then I was like, okay, this is common. So we had a lot of these last round just due to the nature of the prompts, and that is the bake-off.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
so it involves, and these are Dean's words, drama between two long-standing entrants at a Country Women's Association bake-off or country annual fair, etc. Often Mrs. X has always won, but Mrs. Y is going to win this year. Sometimes Mr. X is sleeping with Mrs. Y, or Mr. Y has died for heartstrings. And then they seem to have 20-word titles too, like the unfortunate incident with a lemon cake as judged third place at the annual Avoca Beach Bake-Off, but is under review.
I mean, one of these made our shortlist last round.
This is just too true and quite funny because this is very much what we had last round and we do see them. The bake-off is a common trope. But yeah, it did make the shortlist last time, so it's not impossible to do well with this type of story. But the way Dean's described it is very much the way. It's spot on what we see. So we've now had one in the shortlist. It's going to be very hard for another to make the shortlist.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. The next one, Nick from Twist in the Tail suggested, but which we agreed with as well, is humans are the virus. Okay, so this is another sci-fi trope that we see a bit of, where the world is better off without humans, or where we're somehow comparing humans to a virus. And often it involves like aliens making this assessment, you know, that humans are really a virus on the earth kind of thing. I mean, these sci-fi tropes are always very difficult. And we've talked before about how some of this genre fiction is hard to pull off in flash fiction because you don't have that space for world building and so on. And so what you end up with is just that idea, just that trope, and not much more. You might have different character names, but they're not really doing anything compellingly different to make your story stand out.
So this is maybe not necessarily a trope, but one of our shortlisters last comp in the April round called Adventure Awaits by Tara Babcock. And I felt that story leaned very heavily in on the Hunger Games, you know, that whole situation where the name being drawn out of a hat. So the world building is done for you to some extent in a trope, right? You understand the situation because you've seen it before. Yeah. Right. And then it's
that can be an advantage.
That can be an advantage. And from there, it's what you can do. And what she did very well in that story, Adventure Awaits, is delve into the human side of it, delve into the character side, the emotional side, taking the two primary characters, the mother and the daughter, and focusing in on what they were feeling, what they were experiencing at the time. And so you take the trope and you turn it into a human story. And that's one way you can kind of counteract the fact that you are in a trope. So if you want to write about a world where people live deep underground or where humans are the virus. How can you make that a personal story? How can you develop a character that makes you feel something? Because
and get
you don't
very
feel
specific. Like rather than just sort of overarching, here's the plot, give us a scene, give us a moment from that plot. And that applies to other cliche tropes from longer fiction. And I'll get to that in a sec, but just before I do, another one that I wanted to give a shout out to is the surprise villain. Often it's, it's the person you least expect, right? But often it's presented as like a woman going on a date and you think she's all nervous because she's about to meet a guy, but in fact she's just getting antsy because she's about to murder him.
She's actually a serial killer.
She's a serial killer. And that is one, and in fact Dean brought that one up, but that is one that we see a bit of. And we sort of had, a little bit of a surprise villain work in the January comp, which was Athena Law's first place winning story, where you've got sort of the little old lady who's the villain and the murderer in that case.
I think that was less of a surprise, though. It was more worked into the fabric of the story.
It wasn't a surprise at all, but more that the character was an unlikely villain. Another one that Dean added was death coming to take someone away. And it's always death in the black cloak with the scythe coming to take someone away. So that's a common one that we see as well. And you mentioned the Hunger Games. I think the Hunger Games reaping is something that we see a bit of as well. Now, finally, the last, category, although it has a lot of subcategories, is any story which is just a snapshot of a genre fiction or a trope that we see like in longer fiction.
Yeah.
Boy meets girl, for example, like the meet cute, but it's very much just that. It's just boy meets girl. For some reason, gumshoe detectives are quite popular
Very
and
popular.
we see those.
Yep.
But again, it's just done in that really leaning into the cliche.
It's that scene in the office where the woman walks in.
She's always got red lipstick. Always.
She sits on the desk and it's just that scene.
Yeah, it is specifically that scene. We've also got the hitman who meets his own demise, like the double cross on the hitman. We see that a bit. We've got a lot of heists. Now, heists are a whole category all of their own. And we did see, surprise, surprise, a lot of heists in this round because we had the prompt of stealing something. So, of course, we would. But just sort of that cliche heist, that moment where they go to break in and either they're nabbed or they get away with it. And nothing has sort of been added to it.
Think of all the heist movies that you love, Ocean's 11 or Snatch, Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. It's all about the characters.
Yes.
They're all weird and quirky. They all have their own unique traits and they're really compelling as characters. And it's kind of them all working together that makes it interesting.
And we also care about what they're stealing and why they're stealing it. They're not just stealing generic gems, or if they are, it's for a specific reason. Yeah,
it's definitely not the action of the heist itself without all of the heist is usually 10 minutes worth of the movie, It's all about that character.
Planning.
Yeah, again, this is another thing that's really difficult to write in flash fiction because you can't develop the characters and have the heist. And it's also many characters usually. It's 5 or 6 characters or Ocean's 11 characters. And in Flash, you can really only have 1, 2, maybe 3 characters in your story.
Typically. Yeah, absolutely. And by the same token, a lot of fairy realm or fae realm stories, often they're like confronting a threat, like someone's come to steal the wind or something like that, or the sun or the moon, and they're sort of confronting that threat. And similarly, those sort of epic fantasy stories that you see a lot, the quest stories, and we get the whole quest and we don't get any character, nothing fresh anyway. Like it's those same characters we've seen time and again. And then, that's nice sometimes, like for someone writing that, like sort of leaning into a story that they love and sort of representing it and sort of repackaging that as their own with their own character names and place names and sort of settings and so on that they're sort of enjoying. But often when you're trying to develop all that, that's really more fodder for like a novel. Yeah. And you're not giving us enough of a scene to really latch onto to sort of engage in that story beyond like, oh, this is just another quest. So all of these are just like tropes you see in genre fiction outside of Flash, and they're all beloved. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with any of these. They all have the potential to be great stories. But what we need to see for that to lift in a competition and sort of stand out is for something fresh and new. And usually that is going to be your characters. and what they bring to this old trope. Because a love story, for example, is always going to be interesting. We're human beings. Love stories are never going to go out of fashion. But in a fiction space, to engage in it, we need to care about the two people falling in love very much, to care about their love story. So I guess that's the energy you want to take into it. So that's it. That's our tropes. I mean, I've got a couple more, but I'll leave it for today.
We could go on.
We could go on, right? You do see things come up time and again. And look, if you are not at this point thrashing around violently in frustration because you've done this, right, and getting pissed off because we've just literally described a story that you've written, then you haven't been writing long enough, basically. Keep going.
We've both admitted to writing several of these tropes, and I'm personally mortified that Dean has gone back and reread all my stories. Burn them, Dean. Burn them now. All right, so now it's time for shout-outs. So these are the stories that may or may not have made the long list, but something about them warrants a shout-out. Let's start with favourite titles.
Alrighty. What were your favourite titles?
In no particular order. Actually, these are in the order that we read them.
No, we did not read them in this order. This is the order that they were put in the spreadsheet. That doesn't mean that's the order I read them.
This time around,
did you?
As a side note, I strictly read them in that order.
Did you?
Because normally I just randomly choose batches. But this time I was like, no, I'm going to challenge myself to read all of the stories in the order that they happen to appear in. For no reason, but
That makes one of us. All right.
So the first is On the Veranda of a Cabana Near Havana by Craig Goddard. And I just like the rhyme. And
you got to say it right, though.
But I was just going to say, I think the rhyme works better. I'm not sure if Craig is American or not.
Not with an Aussie accent.
It's an American rhyme. On the veranda of a cabana near Havana. It's a really bad American accent.
Great.
Look, have I mentioned I'm several wines in? Okay. Next is The Fart Wagoning Yegg by Katie Jones.
The what?
That does what a great title is supposed to do. Make you want to know what the hell is going on. The next one by Christy Hartman, If a bee is kept from flowers, the only thing it has left to do is sting. And I'm not sure if this is a saying, if that saying originates anywhere.
Know. Seems like one.
But I like that. A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing by Avril Robertson, and wolf is spelt like Virginia Woolf in that. And I thought that was quite clever. The Real Punishment is Having You as a Father by J.L. Larson.
Ouch.
What I like about that title is it sets up an expectation of, oh shit, there's going to be some drama here. And that's the great thing for a title to do. It kind of sets the tone for the story,
Do you know
right?
what that is? That's the little extract you get at the start of the episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Do you know what I mean?
Like at the start, the little teaser.
Watch. Yeah.
It's Heading for Earth, and spoiler alert, We Don't Stand a Chance by Dean Corey. I like that one because it sets up that comedic vibe that the story is going to have. Marinated Goat's Balls by Anne Morehouse. Do I need to say anything? I want to know what's going to happen with those marinated goat's balls. Hot Desking by Lucy Mack, which I'd noted in my personal notes, has anyone written an erotic fiction called Hot Desking about a workplace romance? I'm 100% they have.
Yes, yeah.
But that's the perfect title. Born and Bred by N.M. Fadsley. Bred, B-R-E-A-D. Cute title.
Love a pun.
Democracy Manifest by Eunice Armitage. And, of course, the reference to the late, great Jack Carlson, who recently died. And if you're not familiar with the Democracy Manifest, go and look up the meme.
No. Ed's going to play it for you now.
Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest. Have a look at the headlock here. See that chap over there? Get your hand off my penis! This is the bloke who got me on the penis before.
Get some cups.
Why did you do this to me?
Hop in the car. Get some cups.
For what reason? What is the charge? Eating a meal? A succulent Chinese meal? Oh, that's a nice headlock, sir. Oh, yes. I see that you know your judo well. Good one. And you, sir, are you waiting to receive my limp penis? How dare get your hands off me.
No, we've only got one cup.
Ta-ta and farewell.
That's all right, just get him in the car.
That man should have been Prime Minister.
Oh, he was, wasn't he? A couple of decades back. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, we've just played it, but basically this guy's like a national hero and total meme worthy. this incident happened many years ago, but it sort of got revived somehow. Someone found it and shared it.
Because it's pure gold.
It's pure gold. And we'll touch on this story later. Let's talk about it later when we get to the anti-prompt. Carry on.
They Shoot Thieves, don't they? By Jennifer Quayle, which is a reference to the movie They Shoot Horses, don't they?
I don't know.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
But thieves being one of our prompts. Not Quite Right by Egsa. And I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Obviously a nice little nod to us.
Strokes the ego.
Exactly. Perry and Patricia, The Purple Prose, present Prose by Kathy Brukovnik. And just to point out, Purple Prose is PROS. We can talk about this with the anti-prompt, but Purple Prose is in the title. And finally, by Sam James, This Is a World with Sentient Desks. I just loved the simplicity, and it's a story about a world with sentient desks. And the title is This Is a World with Sentient Desks. It's almost, and I know the episode has not yet come out, but it's almost Chuck Tingle-like in its directness.
Only if someone starts getting freaky with the sentient desk.
That's right. No one gets slammed in the butt in this story. Okay, what were yours?
All right. So one of my faves was Blurple by Roxanne Kubiak. And I just love, sounds like purple. All right. Where are we going with this?
Yep.
Another, and this is in pun territory, was Table Manners by Lincoln Jones. Manners spelled MANORS. And I was just curious to know where that little pun was going to go. The next one absolutely appeals to my demographic, which is For Blind Dates, We Wear Purple by B.L. Phillips. A nice reference to Mean Girls there. Now, the next one, I guess, is intriguing on its own, but also sort of gains a new meaning upon reading the story, which is quite satisfying, if you will. The Easter Bunny is Coming by Tabby Hunt. Or The Easter Bunny is Coming.
There is an exclamation mark there. Like, there is some urgency in the situation.
And we'll talk about that story in a minute. There's You Weren't Just Born by Jasmine Johnstone. And I like that because obviously, you know, you use the phrase frequently about newborns, that they were just born. And so I was curious to know where this story was going to go, who they were talking to, presumably their child, and what that might mean. She Has Always Loved a Man with a Ponytail by Patricia Fitzgerald. And my husband, who does not have a ponytail and never has, because he denies me the privilege of having a husband with a ponytail, knows full well that I love long hair. And so I appreciated that one.
I like that this title is in all caps. Gets your attention.
As a woman who loves a good ponytail, it's called for. Now, the next one I have to say I read totally wrong. And once I read the story, I was so embarrassed about how this title had come out in my head.
Okay.
All right. And how I read this title was, I'm embarrassed. Flat top grind blades designed to rip.
You thought it was an 80s toy
I
ad.
thought it was just going to be Michael J. Fox on some sort of contraption. It was in fact a horrifying story involving a saw and what was going to happen with that.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, that sort of threw me for a loop, but it's memorable. All right. Antiques, Old People, and Other Things We Ignore by Kyla Mead. That one made me feel bad.
Yeah.
I felt kind of guilty reading that one. But yeah, it's kind of poignant already before the story even begins. Now, this one I love just again for the ego trip of including Ed in this one, which is Shetty Eddie's Discount Cat Toys and How He Keeps His Prices So Low. Bit of fun.
Well,
by
you want to find out, how does he keep his prices so low?
Then we have Girl, it's called Charisma, Uniqueness, Nerve, and Talent, which we called out earlier for being an initialism, and that one's by Ailish Forwells. And that sets up a certain character expectation as well. We've got How to Turn Death into Bitcoin by Itty Bitty Bin Chicken, which in itself is a fun name.
It is, and you know exactly where they're from.
Love Bomb by Jessica Lyons. Now, this is a simple one, but I think love bombing is something that we hear a lot about at the moment. And again, it comes back to that sort of domestic violence sort of issues that we have in society at the moment. So I was intrigued as to how that one was going to be handled. We've got Great Perspicacious Expectations by Claire L. Marsh. obviously a take on Great Expectations that leans into that purple prose, which was fun. Fridgerton, a love story by Athena Law. So Athena Law was our January winner. Fridgerton, a take on Bridgerton there. And it was, in fact, a love story involving the occupants of a refrigerator.
Yeah.
But what I also thought was fun about that, and this is very immature of me, but I thought, what a great, high school insult. Like, if you go back to high school, frigid was a big, thing in high school. You'd hear that getting bandied about. Like, Fridgerton. I'm encouraging bad behaviour there, but...
You know what, though? As an aside, kids are so nice to each other these days.
Are they?
Yeah, they don't bully like they used to. At least in primary school where my kids are, they don't.
Well, there's still bullying. It's all a bit more hidden now, though.
Oh, okay.
It's all a bit more under the radar.
You would never say Fridgerton to someone.
You would not. No. There would be letters going home to parents about Fridgerton, for sure. So don't do that. All right. After a sex dream about my brother, I rethink everything, starting with Tequila by Emily Rinkema. And
this is one of those ones where you're talking about it captures an experience that you've had. And...
excuse me, I have never rethought Tequila, ever. No, that one's pure shock value. I love that and was absolutely intrigued about where that one was going to go. And finally, Just Visiting by A.C. Millington, which was a fun story about a Monopoly table flip. So good fun. So yeah, all of those great attention grabbers at the start, and then the challenge becomes to hold the attention once you've grabbed it.
Okay, well, why don't we continue on to favourite lines?
Okay, some lines that stood out. Cream rises to the top, Darcy, but turds also float. You'll get both kinds tonight. And that's from the Teacher's Report Card by Gregory Burke. And I can fully imagine teachers saying this to each other in the lead up to a parent-teacher interview. This was a first line. This guy bit me yesterday, right on the fucking neck. And that was changed by Torrinell. And that went on to be quite fun too, that one. Now, this one's a little bit sort of dense potentially, so just bear with me. It is not untrue that you must circumvent and eschew a colour intermediate between red and blue for prosaic narration to congrue. And that's from The Night I Dream of the Crow by Izzy Rose. And basically, that's a crow talking, right? In mysterious ways. And that's a very elaborate way to say avoid purple prose.
Yes.
So I thought that was quite clever. So well done, Izzy. And finally, let's just say, boy, that your mother succumbed to my silver tongue in more ways than one. And that's from Silver and Lead by Greg Schmidt.
Okay, so I've got a few, and I was focusing on first lines. These were notes to myself that I made as I read through the stories. On the veranda of a cabana near Havana, or a cabana near Havana, if
Absolutely
you like.
A cabana near Havana.
By Craig Goddard. Hemingway spilled rum all over his 26 Underwood Portable. And I just love where this story is going.
Yeah.
Like, we start with Hemingway. It's got a typewriter. I'm in. I've also got The Night I Dream of the Crow by Izzy Rose here. For its opening line, the night I dream of the crow, it is perched on the back of a sheep in a field of lilac, which is a great image.
All right, let's talk about the prompts. So what I want to do is just go through, as we usually do, I guess some of the more common takes, some of the more original takes, just so everybody can get a sense of, look, what are they up against? Like, what are we seeing and what are some of the cool things and cool ideas that people have had? So we'll start with the word table, the table word prompt. Now, when we came up with this, I mean, we were just being smartasses, really, because we had said in a previous episode that we would never use the word table, and then we went on to use the word table. And what we knew about this was that it was an incredibly versatile word and that, in fact, it could go anywhere. And it did. But what I actually found interesting was how many actual tables we saw.
There were quite a lot,
Yeah, there were a lot. And I was, I guess, expecting people to maybe take a bit more of an obscure approach to that. And what I take from that, I think, is that everyone was just panicking about the anti-prompt.
Yeah.
And they just went, table, easy, forget it, leave it till last, which is totally fine and totally what I would have done.
I feel like with this prompt, you could have just written your story and then just done a control F at the end of it, and there probably would have been a table in it.
In fact, I know of at least one person who did exactly that. And also what I think is interesting is sometimes when I was going through to look at the usages of table, someone would have a table And then they would just have another word with table in it, like inevitable, and maybe didn't realize that it was already there. Now, as you might expect, there were quite a few stories set in restaurants or cafes or dining rooms. So we did see a lot of that. And a lot of different types of actual physical tables, side tables, kitchen tables, dining tables, bedside tables, coffee tables, picnic tables, right? The whole range of tables. And they tended to fade into the background, which is great because you don't want to necessarily overpower your story with every single prompt. Interestingly, there were also quite a few ornate wooden tables with like carvings and things. And so I think once we start placing the focus on something, then we start to look at the details of it. And in this case, a table. What I would say though, just to challenge yourself to consider, is that detail relevant or boosting your story in some way? Or is it perhaps an irrelevant detail? Now, for some people, the table was a big focus and that detail was important. And for others, it was just like, oh, I'm thinking about the table and focusing on it. And so I'm going to describe it in this rich detail where that detail didn't necessarily add to the narrative.
Yeah.
So,
we don't write these prompts with the intention of, hey, send us your table stories.
by all means do, but like, yeah, that's not, we don't necessarily want all that.
It doesn't necessarily need to be the focus.
No, absolutely. Yep. Now, the next one I put out as a bit of a call out on Twitter, a poll, to see people's guesses, what the most common construction of these tables was. And I can only talk about the ones that were specifically noted, and I'll get your guess first.
God.
So was it oak, mahogany, glass, or steel?
I would have expected wood. Wood in my mind was the most common. So oak or mahogany. I'm going to go with oak.
Oak? Correct. Bing, bing, bing. And that was, in fact, the most guessed answer on Twitter as well, with 43% of the vote. Oak was the most common wood used, and wood was absolutely the most common construction. Mahogany came second, equal second with teak. And then we had glass and steel. There was one each that was specified as a glass or a steel table, and one that was specified as wood veneer. Many others were just described as wooden. So oak.
Who knew?
Who knew? Now, I guess because most people did let that prompt fade into the background a bit, the ones that leaned on that prompt stood out. And so I just wanted to call out a few that sort of leaned into the table prompt or had a bit of an original take. So one was The Veil by Megan Griffo. And just specifically, she mentioned a beer pong table, which I thought was fun. I mean, a beer pong table is just a table with cups on it.
That's true. It's not you don't have a dedicated beer pong table in your house.
You might, right? But you don't need to. No. But that was just a fun sort of more original table, I guess, amongst the mix. Then we had Exposure by Rob Bruce, and Rob had a remaining timetable. Okay, so not just a timetable, a remaining timetable. I thought that was clever. In terms of inserting the word table into other longer words, of which there are very many, one of the, I guess, original takes there was from Jory, Blessed Among Instas by Christoph Mikes Liu, who had Insta Blessed, which includes the word table.
Right.
And that was all around social media, that particular story.
Very creative.
Yeah, so a nice new word. And then we had a few who went hard and who went with a lot of words with table. We're going to start with Breaking the Immutable Laws of Sisterhood by Martin Greening, who used 11 different words, including table. But he was beaten in Unstable by Dorothea Helms, who used 18 words, including table, and that includes the title, Unstable being one of them. But they were beaten.
Wow.
By Earnest and Accountable by Cindy Strube, who included 20, including again the title, accountable being one of the words. And Cindy included accountable, comfortable, charitable, constable, notable, tableau, presentable, unstable, inflatable, tablet, disreputable, table, delectable, inevitable times 2, suitable, constable, again, redoubtable, citable, and debatable.
It's great when a prompt inspires someone so much.
Yeah, and goes hard. Now I'm going to do, what's the quick calculation? 4%. 4% of the word count was words with table in it. So good on you for going hard. Love to see a bit of commitment. Now, a couple of, I guess, the more creative, like esoteric ideas. We had The Great Circle by Rowena Farrant, who had the table as an imagined character. So this was a story about a talking cat, but who was sort of having this conflict with what they saw as like a bigger cat, which was the four-legged table. and I thought that was fun. Then we had Just Visiting by A.C. Millington, who had the Monopoly table flip. Now, if I was going to steal a story idea, it would probably be this one.
Yep.
And look, technically it was actually a Monopoly board flip, not the whole table. But with table as a prompt, I was shocked I did not see the table flip. And this was the closest we got. And I appreciated that. Good table flip. That's high drama. Shout out to my beloved friend Tara, who I've known for quite some time. And back in our youth, we used to play Monopoly. Like, that's how bored we used to get back before the internet, right? We would actually play Monopoly as teenagers, and it would always end with a board flip every single time. And it just became part of the joy. So thank you for that, AC Millington.
Last time we played that, which was not that long ago, a few months ago, it ended with my youngest daughter in tears.
You got to flip the board before the tears. This is the thing. When it's funny, when everyone's still having fun, that's key. Now, finally, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this was my favourite take on the table prompt. Yan's Yen by Arkaby, which was about a character who yearns or yens to be a table. I thought that was a really fun, absurd idea.
Really leaning into that table prompt.
Yeah, becoming the prompt. So thanks for those creative ideas. I hope the rest of you listening to that see how obscure you can really go sometimes with something. And maybe when you are feeling stuck on the anti-prompt, starting somewhere else might be a good place to start.
When we joked about that in a previous episode, like, we'll never use that prompt because it popped into mind as like table. It's a completely uninteresting thing.
Yeah.
But some people did take that completely uninteresting thing and actually make it interesting.
Absolutely. Next, let's talk about the steal something prompt. Okay, so this was the action where you had to include the action of stealing something. Naturally, as you might imagine, we had lots of thieves.
Yes.
So cat burglars and heists and shoplifters. Quite common, to be expected. And I also just want to shout out Vroni Kiefer, who actually used all of the 2024 action prompts in her story.
Oh, really?
So nice one, Vroni. And in fact, that's something Ed's leaned into as well in other comps. That's good fun. Good to see you challenge yourself. That's cool. Now, I'm going to ask you, Ed, what do you think was the most stolen thing?
Shit.
Okay. And maybe it's a category of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Was it not jewels?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this category I've just called valuables. All right. So jewels was a big one. Now, I didn't go through every single one like that, but I did make a note, and valuables was it. So it might have been cash, might have been jewels, might have been a watch, for example. So 30 stories involved a theft of some sort of valuable. Now, another common thing that was stolen was hearts, but we had figurative stealing of hearts.
Yes.
And some literal stealing of hearts. So 14 figurative stealing of hearts and 4 literal.
Yeah.
And I think one was an overlap that had both.
Yeah.
So 4 literal heart thefts. That's too many.
It is so hard to be original, isn't it?
It is. It is. And this is the thing, like we're talking about the tropes before. Forget it. Forget being original. Just make it about the character or make it about the detail. And some of these stories did well, right? The ones that maybe weren't original in their idea, but did their idea very well. Now, some other things that were commonly stolen: time, lives, or people. So there were a few kidnappings as well. Girlfriends and boyfriends, like stealing someone's partner. Childhoods, virginities, identities. There's quite a lot of plagiarism of various kinds. Books, bikes.
Yeah.
For some reason, bikes are commonly stolen. How many people did we have from the Netherlands? Food, often by pets. Dreams and memories. And a couple of tables were stolen.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And then we had some figurative things that were stolen, apart from the hearts that I mentioned already. Looks, glances, the stage, the spotlight, the show, and thunder. I'm sort of surprised we didn't see more of that figurative stealing, because there are a few of those idioms around. And now I just wanted to call out maybe some of what at least seemed to us to be some more of the original takes. We had a Fustian Fable by Rachel Parks, which is a bit of a play on words there. And a few did this, but in Rachel's story, the ability to speak normally was stolen. So that was like the purple prose and the steal something going together. We had Noteworthy by Holly Brandon, where Post-its were being stolen. And this particular story was leaning into the idea of how much teachers love their stationery supplies, which I love. I'm not a teacher, but I do love stationery. And I was sort of just glad to see that classic addressed. But I also just wanted to point out that this is the one that made me cry or made me teary, okay? And this was just about stealing Post-it notes, okay? And so if we're talking about manipulating emotions and so on and leaning into that low-hanging fruit, like, you don't have to. You just need to touch on something, I guess, that's a common experience. Or,
So what was it about the Post-it notes that made you cry?
it wasn't really the Post-it notes, okay? It was what went with it. So it was a story about a child who stole the Post-it notes and who was writing themselves little notes in their lunchbox because their friends were getting notes from their parents and they weren't.
Yes, that's right.
Apart from my sanity being stolen, The Easter Bunny is Coming by Tabby Hunt also talked about Easter eggs being stolen, and this was relatable on that
level.
element alone, I just want to specify. The rest of the story, not relatable.
It goes in a different direction, doesn't it?
It goes in a different direction, but I definitely steal Easter eggs, and I will never be able to unsee this story. So thank you very much. We had Release by Jennifer Bush, who talked about depression as the thief of happiness. So I thought that was interesting as well. And we had a couple of others that sort of touched on those sort of themes of, I guess, stealing someone's joy. We had The Abyssal Diamond by Josh Say. I was talking about how we had a lot of heists. And you know how earlier we were saying the tropes, a heist is a common one and it's about what else you can bring? This is what I'm going to call an anti-heist. The gem stole the person.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really fun, a very cool idea. We had Yours with Love by Daniel Clark Mudge. And in this story, the narrative voice was being stolen from the narrator by someone else. So like just getting a bit clever with it, I guess, and playing with the idea of the story being stolen as it's being told. And I thought that was fun. We had Jasmine and Every Other Flavour of Purple by Alison Tate. In this story, it was just shampoo and conditioner that was stolen.
Yeah.
And it was so petty, and I'm here for it. And then finally, another shout out for Democracy Manifest by Eunice Armitage, where the thing being stolen was a succulent Chinese meal.
A succulent Chinese meal.
Now, I didn't sort of mention it before, but again, anyone who follows us on Twitter might have seen this happen. But I was reading through the stories and getting immersed in the purple prose, and our mate Jack Carlson popped into my head because I was getting all this purple prose. Like a lot of people were really leaning into the purple prose, and this image of him as just the ultimate orator popped into my head. And then like literally not even 5 minutes later, Democracy Manifest, this story. And I'm just like, we are on the same wavelength. This is insane.
And then he died.
And I feel like,
That's crazy.
Eunice, I think it's our fault. So thanks to everyone for your creative takes on stealing something. But now, I guess apart from that other moment that you're still potentially waiting for, this moment that you've been waiting for is the discussion about the anti-prompt and how different people handled it, because I think we can both acknowledge, Ed, that this was a hard one. I felt like this was challenging.
Yeah, I think this is probably the hardest one.
Yeah, because we know it's bad. You know when you read it that it's can be quite dense and hard to read. And so how do we approach this prompt?
How do you do it intentionally?
Oh, plenty of people do it.
Throw a bit of purple prose in, but how do you make it kind of fit your story and be an intentional thing?
Well, how do you? How would you have handled this prompt?
The problem is that it really depends on the story, obviously. It needs to be something that links back into the story. But I think for me, like the ideas I have are pretty boring.
No comment.
It's either going to be a character who uses it occasionally, like that's one angle you could take. You build the character around the idea of someone who speaks with purple prose, or you take a piece of purple prose that's external to the story. So maybe a character reads like an invitation that's written in flowery language and that's in there. So it's some way of putting it in that's not
like that feels
obtrusive.
Natural.
It's not your own writerly prose being purple, but it's in the story. So that's kind of a way to sidestep it. That's me being kind of logical about it, but not that interesting. And I think some of the ones that we saw were way more interesting than that.
I guess for me, the way I think I would have handled it, and it's impossible to know, but I think I would have done what some people did and leaned into some sort of literal purple object within the story and talked about that somehow and made a story of that. I have no idea what it would have been, but I think taking it down that angle as opposed to writing that flowery language probably would have felt more natural for me.
Yeah.
Because I write, elaborate things sometimes, but mostly I'm a bit more straightforward.
Yeah.
So what I found analysing the stories was that there were 5 categories of different ways of approaching the anti-prompt. And the first one I called goes hard.
Yeah.
In other words, they really leaned into it. And there were a number of different ways that was done, but nevertheless, the story was very heavily purple prose. And either that was leaning into that sort of romantic kind of language aspect, or it was someone exaggerating for fun. And, some people pulled that off really well. We had some purple prose as the next category, so people who just had a bit.
Yeah.
We had purple objects, like I mentioned, that was a whole category, and people using purple objects to handle the anti-prompt. The fourth one, and I probably should be higher than fourth because it was quite common, was using a certain character voice. So someone who, as you mentioned, would sort of speak in that way or write in that way. And then the final category being other, for those really creative takes. So I just wanted to go into each of those categories a little bit and just talk about the different ways within those categories that people handled it. In the goes hard category, we had a lot of letter writers. So I guess people feel that letter writing is an area where people get a bit more elaborate with the way they speak to each other, I guess, the way they communicate.
Yeah, and I've got a list of examples, and so I might just list them as you go. So the example I have of this is a story by Frederick Dios called Letters Courting Eliania. And that has purple prose delivered through letters from suitors, so from people trying to...
And there were a few stories like that, where there was like love letters. And there was one memorable one for me, although I don't have the title or the author, I'm sorry, in front of me right now, but it was actually a pedophile writing letters to a young girl.
Yeah.
Which was quite a confronting idea.
Yeah, that was A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing by Averil Robertson. So that's the little pun of a wolf in sheep's clothing, and also someone who writes well and says sweet things.
Yeah, memorable, challenging sort of story.
Yeah.
Now, I would say in this category, and there were other sort of like romantics and sort of theatrical people and so on, and we'll get to that as well when we get to the character voice side of things, but just some advice relating to the ones that go hard. Okay, now, again, the article that we had on the website about purple prose was advising the reasons why you're typically advised to avoid it, okay, because it can become distracting from the story. And I think in some cases it did for people, mostly when there were issues with clarity. And there were some stories where there were big issues with clarity, where the purple prose was dense throughout and I was just lost.
Yeah.
And it was like doublespeak to me. I couldn't figure it out. And even on rereading, like it became quite a struggle to understand. Now, to me, that's never going to be a compelling story, because it's just too hard and too dense to get invested in. And especially when, and maybe this is unfair, but especially when you're reading hundreds of stories, it's going to be really hard to sort of get past that and appreciate it. Another issue that I noticed in this goes hard category was much ado about nothing, right? Lots of really vivid description about stuff that had no bearing on the story.
Yeah.
Now, this is one of the specific categories we called out in that article, like, oh, it's really beautiful, flowery language, but the detail you're describing is just completely irrelevant to the story. And you need to be focusing on details which further your story. They might be establishing character or establishing a setting that's relevant, or plot, or revealing some subtext. And, I talk about Poe's single effect theory, like how are those details building towards the theme and the emotional impact of your story as well. So I guess thinking about what you're describing is super important, whether or not you're using purple prose. That's always going to be an issue.
Like we always say, the anti-prompt is a challenge and not a license. All of these writing rules are there for a reason, and in the case of purple prose, it can really distract from your story. It can make it difficult to read, and that's why you should avoid it.
I think too, and this goes back to the clarity issue, there were some stories in which it was evident to me that the person didn't even understand the words that they were using, like, how are all your right-click fingers going? Like, who was right-click thesaurus, right-click synonyms on every second word? There were some stories, in fact, where I was suspicious as to whether ChatGPT got involved or some similar tool, because it very much felt like these words were being replaced with words that didn't actually hold the same meaning. They were a synonym, but not close enough to make sense in the context. And so where the writer doesn't even understand what they're saying, that's a problem, because it's not going to be communicated on the other side. So if you did use ChatGPT and say, I've written these sentences, make them purple, we probably picked that up, I'm afraid, because that would have been very evident and not something that produced a better story.
Yeah, regardless of whether we notice that you're using ChatGPT or not, that's not a great way to write a story.
No.
Yeah.
And even the right-click synonym, which I do all the time, by the way, when I'm writing, because sometimes you want to change it up or just like think a bit more creatively about what you're doing. Perfectly valid thing to do. But when you're replacing it with the wrong word that doesn't actually have the same meaning, that's going to be a problem. So there were some challenges with that goes hard kind of angle that people took. However, I will applaud you all for embracing the challenge, because it was bloody hard. And I'm sure you were doing it knowing like, oh, this is hard and this is dense. And I hope that even just by doing that exercise, even if you didn't produce a story that you particularly loved, I hope exploring that helped you sort of see maybe some of those limitations and how maybe you could write more clearly or beautifully, but also simply, because I think that can be compelling too. So the next category is some purple prose. Okay, so people who just dabbled a little bit, and that was probably going to be a little bit easier to pull off than the goes hard category.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes it was the same issues, right, with lack of clarity or with focusing in on a detail that didn't really have bearing on the plot. But I think it worked well when the purple prose was being used to achieve a specific effect. So they were really like clear about the reason why they were.
Yeah, there has to be that reason there.
And so, and a good example for that I felt was Lost for Words by Paul Miller, who used a game of Scrabble as the setting for some purple words. So, you know, Scrabble is a place where you're going to have these big words that you don't normally use in real life. Yeah. So I thought that was a clever way to bring the big words in. And then reasons for using more elaborate language, which included describing things like art or decadent food, these kinds of areas where you'd be more inclined to sort of get a bit more verbose and creative with your language.
I've got a couple on my list that might fall into that category. So the first one is The Photographer by Sarah Hurd. This story is about a photographer, and it takes that photographer's perspective on setting up this perfect shot and describing what they see as they set up the perfect shot. Where I think that's clever is that story uses purple prose as a kind of way to animate what a photographer is thinking in that moment. And the description, the flowery description, mirrors the composition of the shot. Another one is Kingdom of the Unhoused by Martini Lin. The main character reads a fantasy novel at the beginning, and so the story references the specific purple prose extract from the fantasy novel and then builds on the main character's mental state, developing from that purple prose and the head in the fantasy world perspective. So I thought that was quite clever as well.
And I think there were a lot that were inspired by other sort of purple literature. We had like the classics like Greek mythology and so on. We had someone who referenced Latin. Famous playwrights were mentioned, poets, lyricists. And then we had like at the other end of the spectrum, I guess, the bodice ripper novels and other like super famously purple prose, like It Was a Dark and Stormy Night was referenced. And then in popular culture, like 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight, who famously also use purple prose.
Yep.
And who are super fucking rich now, right? Those authors. So it doesn't necessarily always go wrong. But there was one story which was Happy for You by Arabella Peterson, who straight up quoted Twilight. And I just want to share this line from Twilight because it's famously very purple. His skin, white despite the faint flush from yesterday's hunting trip, literally sparkled, like thousands of tiny diamonds were embedded in the surface.
So hot.
It's so hot right now. So a lot of inspiration being drawn from other sources, I guess. And that was handled in a whole range of different ways. That to me was smart. I think that was a good way to handle it, where it was like manageable, didn't have to overtake everything. So the next category was, and this is the one I thought I might have slotted into if I was in the competition, is purple objects. And again, handled in a whole range of different ways. But people going, well, technically I wrote about a purple thing, so that's purple prose. Absolutely, tick, correct. But what I did find was that they didn't just tick and flick, right? They leaned into it and they used a lot of purple. So it wasn't just like one purple item, it became the theme of the story. Sometimes it was just one thing, right? But it was a crucial thing to the story and it was something very important to the character as well. There were a lot of purple pens, a lot of purple ink flowing, so that technically we had purple words and purple prose, so that's clever. And then purple notes and purple letters, like written on purple paper or indeed a purple Post-it note.
So one story relating to that, which I want to call out, is Hot Desking, again, by Lucy Mack. And that was one that had a literal purple crayon that was used for writing.
Oh, there you go. For some reason, we had a lot of purple gemstones. I felt like there were quite a few.
Being stolen.
Yes, a lot being stolen, funnily enough. And there was some sort of witch and warlock sort of stories as well involving purple gemstones. And I think purple is a colour that's often sort of linked to that fantasy realm. Yeah. Wizard's cloaks, right? There are also quite a lot of bruises, so purple skin. And I'm not sure, sometimes that felt maybe subconscious, but I mean, maybe it's just by nature of the fact that we get a lot of stories about domestic violence and violence in general. Now, just a few I wanted to call out in this objects category. A Purple Pulse That Beats Through Time by Melanie Mulrooney, who used purple objects and wove them throughout the story and they became the plot beats. So I'm just going to read a line from this story. Every year on the anniversary, I feast on blueberries. I fill myself with small bombs of memory and grief, gagging at the texture when they're especially squishy, puckering at the ones that are sour. I choke them down until my stomach revolts and screams stop. Now, this was quite an emotional story about a child reflecting on a parent, and it had purple objects throughout, and these became the memories, and the mother's favourite colour was purple, and so it's all woven together and tied nicely together at the end as well. So that was quite a strong, I think, take on the objects. And then again, I mean, it just keeps coming up, but Democracy Manifest by Eunice Armitage, who also, apart from the purple prose of the character, was referencing a lot of purple objects. But specifically, I wanted to call out that this story included the RGB value of 54,163, which is a type of purple, which I can only describe as grimace purple. But I thought that was fun, just bringing in the RGB colours. And then This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things by Sanya Demova. And that story was entirely inspired by Taylor Swift and Taylor Swift's song Lavender Haze. I think you should play a bit of it.
I feel the lavender haze creeping up on me. So real. I'm damned if I do give a damn what people say. No deal. The 1950s shit they want from me. I just wanna stay in that lavender haze.
And then the whole story was titles of Taylor Swift songs. It was very topical
I do recall that one.
at the moment. I mean, are we now in a lavender haze with Taylor, having read these purple stories? And the next category, quite a common category, in fact, probably should have been up there with one of the top, is character voice. So finding a specific character who suited speaking or writing in purple prose. Now, I should point out that, again, it needed to be relevant to the story, and I think some people sort of lost that point.
I think there needed to be more to the story than just the fact that they spoke that way. Another story, A Golden Pocket Watch by Madeline Howard, which had a character who spoke in purple prose as a means to distract and buy time to steal something, basically. So that was two prompts in one, but there was a reason for that character speaking that way, and the reason wasn't just that's how they spoke.
Yeah, I think making it justified within the story and not just for the sake of it kind of thing was crucial. So I'm just going to go into, because there was some double ups, and triple ups here and there of different ideas, but just some of the different types of characters who tended to speak in purple prose. Now we had, like I mentioned before, lots of letter writers, love bombers, poets, playwrights and thespians, this romance sort of area. We had witches, wizards, gnomes, and magicians. And I just wanted to particularly call out Trapped in Purple by David van der Zwaan, because his witch was delivering a villain monologue, which I love as well. You know, like in the Bond movie where they just suddenly start monologuing about exactly what they're going to do, and meanwhile James Bond gets out of the trap. But it's always so overly theatrical, so I thought that was quite fun. For some reason, we had a few Renaissance Fair attendees as well. There were a few of those. And we had a few variations on the idea of people who started talking or writing in purple language after being affected by some sort of external force or magic. And I'll just call out particularly Changed by Torrinell, which I mentioned earlier, where they were bitten by some kind of Renaissance Fair virgin vampire. And then their language started to develop from this really sort of what we would call bogan language in Australia to this real purple, like Ren Fair attendee kind of language. I thought that was funny. We had one character who stole a thesaurus and then started speaking in purple prose, and a kid who had a word of the day calendar, which was quite a cute character development for that child. And that was the Purloined Pen by Jennifer Palmer with the word of the day calendar. We had a couple of drag queens as well. So again, that theatrical kind of character. And I just wanted to call out Girl, it's called Charisma, Uniqueness, Nerve and Talent by Ailish Forwells. And there was a comment just in the brief description that said, if you aren't queer or not familiar with queer culture, some of the references may be lost on you as a reader. I encourage you to jump on board and embrace it nonetheless. Now, this was about a drag queen specifically dressed as Ursula the Sea Witch. Now, I am not queer myself, but I have a friend who dressed as Ursula the Sea Witch in a drag queen performance. So that was here in Australia. So that's kind of funny. Okay, we had some neurodivergent characters who were speaking in quite, I guess, formal language. We also had people with head injuries. We had people or a person who was experiencing extreme sleep deprivation, and that's why they were starting to go a bit purple. We had a handful of stoners or drug-affected people who were speaking in purple prose.
Yeah, I'd like to call out one actually related, the prose, PROS, by Rob Hines, in which purple prose was used to describe like a drug-induced trip, which I think is a great use.
Yeah, absolutely. It made sense perfectly. We also had people who speak corporate jargon. I thought that was a fun take.
Yeah.
We had an overly dramatic teenager. We also had some parents who were dealing with teenagers by being overly dramatic. And then we had some sentient objects who, for whatever reason, were speaking in purple. We had a robot. We had some talking cats, a sentient bow tie, and we had a sentient eggplant or aubergine for some of our foreign listeners.
Which is purple.
Which is literally purple. That, in fact, it might even be RGB 54163. Now, what I wanted to call out about all of these types of characters is that almost all of them were men.
Right.
And what do you think about that?
You think that men are more prone to speaking in purple prose?
These people think, our entrants think that men are more inclined to speak like total wankers.
Well, 71% of our writers are women, so maybe that has something to do with it.
It may do. But honestly, and there would have been more, but if there were 100 stories, I reckon a solid 92 would have been men, at least. Like it was almost all men. And I was just starting to think, oh, interesting. I don't know. But yeah, you're right. We do have a high percentage of women writing here. All right. And now the final category of other, which for us as judges is probably the most fun category.
The most interesting, yeah.
Because it's the one where we go, wow, I never would have thought of that. So I just wanted to do some specific call-outs of the more original takes on the anti-prompt. So listen in. This is how to do it, guys. Potentially. I'm not saying they necessarily long-listed or short-listed or any of that, but they certainly gave us something to think about with their idea. Now, there's sort of a subcategory here, which is the people that went really overtly sexual. Like purple prose is about flowery, elaborate language, but purple is also a word that's often used to associate with like erotica or things that are explicitly sexual. So a few people went there, and I'm just going to call out Roxanne Kubiak with Blurple.
Yeah.
Who was basically, it was a love letter to his own penis.
Yeah.
And from this story, did you take that he'd named his penis Blurple?
Maybe. It's one extra layer I didn't consider.
Because everyone's got a name for it, right?
I don't know, do they? I think that's a weird thing to do.
Do you know what else is a weird thing to do? Writing a love letter to your penis. All right. We also had A Tremendously Wonderful Adventure by Freya King. And this was another penis story. This, in fact, was a sentient penis.
Yep.
And it was a story about like a sort of safari kind of trip to a volcano. The volcano very much being not even a double entendre, just an entendre.
I just like to point out that both of the penis stories seem to be written by women, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
based on the names.
Based on the name.
And the interesting take on the purple thing, apart from it being a sexual story, was that she was playing on the idea of a mistranslation. So we had the penis character who was like basically rallying the troops to go on this adventure and speaking in this overly flowery language. And then we had someone who was trying to translate that for the locals. And that was part of the plot and how that was mistranslated. So I thought that was quite clever, like trying to take the purple prose and communicate it.
Yeah. I think there were a few stories actually that had purple prose resulting in miscommunication as their theme.
Yeah,
At
that's
least
true.
a few.
Now, I will say, and this goes back to the brief explanation field in the submission form, the sexual nature of this story completely went over my head when I read it. Completely went over my head. And it wasn't until I looked back on the brief explanation and I got confused. I'm like, what do you mean by that? That explanation? I couldn't quite get it. And I read it again and I had to read it again, honestly. Maybe I'm a bit slow. Finally got it. And then the lulls ensued. Now, another one that sort of down this track was The Warm Glow of Purple Prose by Lisa H. Owens. And this was where purple prose was sort of literally turned into a type of porn in this story world where this person was sneaking off to like a secret club to go and like engage in purple prose or whatever. And I thought that was quite unique, that take. And finally, one of the most overtly sexual stories was The Easter Bunny is Coming by Tabby Hunt, which was a story about a character who eats all their children's Easter eggs. Their talking cat then ripped a hole in the fabric of the space-time continuum or whatever in the kitchen, and then they went to plead with the Easter Bunny to come and deliver the chocolate to the kids. Now, the Easter Bunny asked a little price for that, and that price was a bunny blowjob. Then this is where my personal relatable experience starts to diverge a little bit. Slightly. All right, now, some other creative takes. We mentioned this one earlier, but it's The Night I Dream of the Crow by Izzy Rose. And it's a talking crow, which is talking about avoid purple prose in its sort of extremely elaborate way of speaking. We had Meant for Her by Tess Allen. And this was a story about a character called Violet. And the story was told from Violet's perspective. So it was therefore purple prose because it was Violet's thoughts. We had Best Laid Plans by S.J. Snyder. And this was parents who were using like elaborate language as a kind of code so their toddler wouldn't understand what they were talking about. We had Jory Blessed Among Instas by Christoph Mikes Liu, which was sort of using overblown Instagram comments, like overly dramatic Instagram comments as the source of that purple prose. We had On the Veranda of a Cabana near Havana by Craig Goddard, which was really the essence of purple prose, like where that comes from, and a fun take basically on Hemingway hating it because, of course, Hemingway famously writes very straight prose. Yeah. We had Safe Haven by Alicia Rourke, and Alicia indicated that this was an idea she'd had for a while, hoping to get the purple prose prompt.
Yeah.
And this was a character with synesthesia, so they experience the world and see it in colours. We had Pearl's Failure to Write a Song is in No Way My Fault by Romany Jane. And this was a fun story. Like we had others that talked about song lyrics, I guess, but this was really using the song lyrics as like the whole plot of the story. And then we had The Final Letter by Kirill Krayushkin, which was a secret code basically in a letter. So a really flowery letter written between imprisoned people. Now, beyond this, we had not only creative takes, but ones which like really leaned into the creative anti-prompt take. And one of those was This Is a World with Sentient Desks by Sam James. And we mentioned that one before. But basically, the sentient desks were turning normal words purple.
Yeah.
Like that was their agenda, because desks love like really elaborate words.
Leaning about as heavily as you could possibly go into 2 separate prompts there.
Yes, seriously. And I mean, the desk is a type of table.
Yeah, exactly.
We had It's Heading for Earth and spoiler alert, We Don't Stand a Chance by Dean Corey. And this story was about a giant purple metaphor headed for Earth. That's correct. Not a meteor, a metaphor. And then finally, the last one I wanted to call out is But One Man Loved the Pilgrim Soul in You by Linda Atkins. And I'll just read out a little bit of the brief explanation from this one from Linda, which was, this story is designed to be experienced across multiple media. The title is a quote and the music is referenced within. After all, purple prose is meant to be excessive. So this story had its own musical score.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love like thinking outside the box of the story, right? You've made us now think about a song as well as your story. And I think that's pretty cool.
There were a couple of other stories that I wanted to just mention, and I'm not sure which category they fall into, but probably the everything else category, just for their unique and out there takes. The first one is Temptation by Alwyn Snow, and this is one where a writer is tempted by purple prose, a literal entity who turns up and tries to convince the protagonist to use purple prose. Kind of a more subtle one, Penville Park by George Favell. And this is a story that contains kind of a mystery at its centre, a little bit of ambiguity. And the story uses purple prose really is the centre of that mystery. And there's a phrase which is, a galaxy contained within transcendent skin danced with gravity atop the lonesome swing. And part of it is trying to figure out what that is actually describing. I'm going to call out Fridgerton by Athena Law, which is purple prose in its parody / homage to Bridgerton, which I'm in the middle of watching at the moment. So that was very on topic for me. And lastly, Perry and Patricia, The Purple Prose Present Prose by Kathy Prokovnik. And I just want to call this out because one of the things that we saw in the last couple of comps where the anti-prompt became a named character within the story, and we saw that with Said and we saw that with cliches. This is one of the only ones this time around that actually had characters called purple prose. Right? So that was something that we saw a lot more last time.
So I think possibly we're talking to people in the future right now who are coming back to this episode because maybe they've only just discovered the Not Quite Right prize, or maybe they've entered before and they're going to refresh their memory. Maybe they've got a bit of writer's block for another comp that we're running and they're coming back to listen to how people have handled things. So I hope you see how creative people can be when they just completely let the restrictions go and let their freak flags fly and write whatever it is that they imagine. And we love to see it. So yeah, I hope everyone's feeling really inspired to take that leap and do something a little bit different.
Yeah, and like I said, I could not have conceived of the majority of these approaches. There were just so many.
And that's what's beautiful about it, I think, that together, like this creativity is just exploding. But look, there is also nothing wrong with taking that lighter touch approach. If you're not confident or if you don't come up, like obviously we're not always going to come up with these crazy stellar ideas. That's unrealistic to expect. So if you're not going there, then maybe take that safer route, but tell a really good story and that will shine through as well.
So this is it. After all of that ado, but without further ado. Well, a little bit more further ado. So we're about to read the long list. So these are the 40 entries that make up the long list. The short list and the winner are included in these 40 names. But the 2 wild cards may or may not be included.
In fact, I can tell you that in this round of the competition, one of the wild cards does not feature on the long list.
That's right. So if you don't hear your name, there is still hope for you yet. So here are the 40 long list entries for the July 2024 Not Quite Right prize for flash fiction. Blurple by Roxanne Kubiak. Kingdom of the Unhoused by Martini Lynn. Soothsayer by Caviar K. Pass the Salt by Chloe Hoare.
On the Veranda of a Cabana near Havana by Craig Goddard. The Colander by Valentine O'Connor. Why I'm Single by Jen Fortner. For Blind Dates, We Wear Purple by B.L. Phillips.
It's Heading for Earth and spoiler alert, We Don't Stand a Chance by Dean Corey. The Easter Bunny is Coming by Tabby Hunt. You Weren't Just Born by Jasmine Johnston. Time Thief by Natalie Harris.
Penville Park by George Faville. Fridgerton, A Love Story by Athena Law. After a sex dream about my brother, I rethink everything, starting with tequila by Emily Rinkemer. Lost and Found by Nikki Crutchley.
Marinated Goat's Balls by Anne Morehouse. But One Man Loved the Pilgrim Soul in You by Linda Atkins. That Which Is Taken by Puka Beeg. Hot Desking by Lucy Mack.
Whose God Is It by Tegan Thornhill. A Golden Pocket Watch by Madeline Howard. Putting Affairs in Order by Joe Skinner. 12 Jars by Autumn Bettinger.
The Devil's Table by Rebecca Ahola. Insurmountable by Christina Wilson. A Purple Pulse That Beats Through Time by Melanie Mulrooney. Noteworthy by Holly Brandon.
Pearl's failure to write a song is in no way my fault by Romany Jane. Valerie, or the vixen who has stood as both my closest confidant and ongoing adversary since our tender days of youth, our perpetual rivalry, the harbinger of my eventual downfall, by Sheridan Bell. The Date by Amanda Larson. Let Go by Lauren Doherty.
Lilac's Protection by Morgan West. His Purple Rain by Jamie Gill. This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things by Sonia Demova. Off-Road by R.C. Barajas. The Kindness of Strangers by Elaine Joy DeGarle. Good First Impression by Rachel Crane. Honeyed Voice Like a Song by Chloe Thornhill. And finally, Till Death Do Us Part by Kaylee Smith. A huge congratulations to those 40 authors. I hope you're cheering right now. Don't drive off the road. And I would just like to say, in the immortal words of our last winner, Chad Frame, the real winner was the stories we made along the way. Now, for all of you 40 participants, if you log on to the website now and go to the past winners section of the prize, you can actually find a little tile there, a little badge that we've made for you that you can just save to your device and post to social media if you would like to. And if you do, please do tag us. Our social media handles are accessed on the website as well. Tag us so that we can join in your celebration, because it is very, very exciting. And I know too that there will be a lot of disappointed people not hearing their names. For one thing, do remember you may be a contender for that wild card. But also, we've got another little special badge up there for you guys to have as well. So if you want to join in the fun but didn't make the long list, there's a badge there for you too. And you can not only share those badges on social media, but you can print them out. You can put them up on your wall, like just blow them up huge.
Like get a tattoo of it.
Take them to your tattoo artist, say, stick that right on my butt.
That would be not quite right.
But I would suggest waiting for the shortlist episode to come out, because the last thing you want to do is get a long list tattooed on your butt and then make the shortlist.
Yeah, so of those 40 people, the winner is among you, as is second, third, fourth, and the honourable mentions and one wildcard. So there's a few happy people yet to find out that news. But the other thing, apart from the prize money, is the Not Quite Right prize trophy. And I will be delighted to post out the trophy to the not lucky but talented winner. So yeah, we'll be waiting till the shortlist announcement, and then we'll be contacting all the winners to get you the prize money and that trophy.
The shortlist episode will be coming up very soon. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, the Daredevil episodes will be coming out directly after. We'll be recording those in a week's time.
If you do have a critique for this particular round, you can expect to receive that before the next round begins, but probably not long before, to be honest, because we are often quite deep in getting these episodes out to you. But please, if you have any questions about that, do reach out via email and we're happy to discuss that with you. But I just want to thank every single one of you, whether you made that long list or not. We read your story and I'm just so thrilled to have all this creativity and I hope that you enjoyed it. I know a lot of people in the form said that they did and they had a lot of fun and they felt like it was a good challenge, and that just fills me with joy. So as much as it might be disappointing to not hear your name on that list, I hope that you really do truly see yourself as a winner for having even submitted, because there are some people who bought a ticket and didn't manage that this round, and that's a challenge in itself. So well done to you.
Well done and thank you, because we always enjoy reading your stories. And as I said earlier, it was great to hear all the positive feedback, and it's great to hear that you guys are enjoying it too.
We love you guys.
And until the next episode, which will be the shortlist episode, right on.
Right on.
Thank you for listening to Not Quite Right. If you'd like to reach us via email or follow us on social media, you can find all the links on our website, notquiterightpodcast.com. That's WRITE. And if you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcasting app.